Chapter number 5 of Faery Lands of the South Seas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Chapter 5. A Memory of Mauke. We sighted Mauke at dawn. The cabin lamp was still burning when the boy brought my coffee. I drank it, lit a cigarette, and went on deck in a pirogue. The skipper himself was at the wheel. Half a dozen men were in the shrouds. The native passengers were sitting forward, cross-legged in little groups, munching ship biscuit and gazing ahead for the expected land. The day broke wild and gray, with clouds scuttling low over the sea in squalls of rain. Since we had left Mutiny the day before, it had blown heavily from the southeast. A big sea was running, but in spite of 60 tons of copra, the schooner was reeling off the knots in racing style, running almost free, with the winds well aft of the beam, rising interminably in the back of each passing sea, and taking the following slope with a swoop and a rush. We had no log. It was difficult to guess our position within a dozen miles. The low, driving clouds surrounding us like a curtain made it impossible to see more than a few hundred yards. Until an observation could be obtained, the landfall was a matter of luck and guesswork. Our course had been laid almost due north-northeast, to pass a little to the west of Mauke, which gave us the chance of rising Mialto or Aitu if we missed the first island. But ocean currents are uncertain things, and with a horizon limited to less than half a mile, nothing would be easier than to slip past the trio of low islands and into the stretch of lonely ocean beyond. Every trading skipper is accustomed to face such situations. One can only maintain a sharp lookout and hold on one's course until there is an opportunity to use the sextant, or until it becomes obvious that the land has been passed. A squall of rain drove down on us for 5 minutes while we shivered and the scuppers ran fresh water. Our narrow circle of vision was blotted out. Then suddenly, with the effect of a curtain drawn aside, the clouds broke to the east, flooding the sea with light. A shout went up. Close ahead and to starboard, so near that we could see the white breakers on the reef, was Mauke, densely wooded to the water's edge, a palm top rising here and there above the thick bush of ironwoods. Next moment the curtain descended. Gray clouds and rearing seas surrounded us. It was as though we had seen a vision of the land, unreal as the blue lakes seen at midday on the desert. But the skipper was shouting orders in harsh Mangyan. The schooner was swinging up into the wind. The blocks were clicking and purring as half a dozen boys swayed on the mainsheet. Presently the land took vague form through the mist of squalls. We were skirting the reef obliquely, drawing nearer the breakers as the settlement came in view. A narrow boat passage, into which an ugly surf was breaching, had been blasted through the hard coral of the reef. A path led up the sloping land beyond, between a double row of canoe houses, to the bush. A few people were gathering by the canoe houses. It was evident that we had just been sighted, and that it would be some time before a boat could be put out, if indeed the boatmen were willing to risk the surf. Meanwhile we could only stand off and on until they came out to us, for the skipper had no intention of risking his ship's boat and the lives of his men on such a forbidding shore. "Aurori," he sang out, dwelling long on the last syllable of this Cook Island version of Hard Aloi. The schooner rounded into the wind with a ponderous deliberation calculated to make the nerves of a fair-weather sailor twitch. She seemed to hesitate, like a fat and fluttering grandmother. At last, after an age of bobbing and ducking into the head seas, while boom tackles were made fast and headsails backed, she made up her mind and filled away on the port tack. Riley, the American coconut planter, who was recruiting labor for the season on his island, turned to me with a wink. "If this old hooker was mine," he remarked in a voice meant to reach the skipper's ears, "I'd start the engine every time I came about. She can't sail fast enough to keep steerage way." The skipper sniffed a British sniff. They are old friends, "If this damn fine schooner was yours," he observed, without turning his head, "she'd have been piling up long ago, like as not in broad daylight on an island 1,000 feet high." Riley chuckled. "Too early for an argument," he said. "Let's go below and have a drink." I have not often run across a more interesting man than Riley. Thrown together as he and I have been in circumstances which make for an unusual exchange of confidence, I have learned more of him in 2 months than one knows of many an old acquaintance at home. At 35 years of age, he is a living object lesson for those who bewail the old days of adventure and romance, and wish that their lives had been cast in other times. His blood is undiluted Irish. He has the humor, the imagination, the quick sympathy of the race, without the Irish heritage of instability. Born in South Boston and reared with only the sketchiest of educations, he set out to make his way in the world at an age when most boys are playing marbles and looking forward with dread to the study of algebra. For 15 years he wandered, gathering a varied background of experience. He worked in mills. He drifted west and shipped as cabin boy on vessels plying the Great Lakes. He drifted further west to become a rider of the range. Finally he reached San Francisco and took to the sea. He has been a sealer, an Alaska fisherman, an able-bodied seaman on square riggers sailing strange seas. He has seen Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope. He speaks of the ports of India, China, Africa, the Java Sea, as you would speak of Boston or New York. In the days when a line of schooners ran from San Francisco to Tahiti, touching at the Marquesas on the way, he felt a call to the South Seas, and shipped for a round trip before the mast. When he returned to San Francisco, a change seemed to have come over him. The old wandering life had lost its charm, had gone flat and stale. Like many another, he had eaten of the wild plantain, unaware. The evenings of carousal ashore no longer tempted him, even the long afternoons of reading, for reading has always been this curious fellow's chief delight, stretched on his bed in a sailor's boarding-house, had lost their flavor. The print blurred before his eyes, and in its place he saw islands of savage loveliness, rising from a warm blue sea, shadowy and mysterious valleys, strewn with the relics of a forgotten race. The dark eyes of a girl in Toihai. Remember that Riley was both a sailor and an Irishman, a rough idealist, keenly susceptible to beauty and the sense of romance. It is stated that the men who live romance are seldom aware of it. This may be true, though I doubt it. Certainly in Riley's case the theory does not work out. He is the most modest of men, untainted by a hint of egoism in his stories, superbly told with the Irish gift for circumstantial detail and dramatic effect. The teller's part is always small, and yet as one listens, thrilled by the color and artistry of the tale, one is all the while aware that this man appraises his memories at their full value, reviews them with a ripened gusto and ever-fresh appreciation. In short, he is one of those fortunate or unfortunate men for whom realities, as most of us know them, do not exist, men whose eyes are incapable of seeing drab or gray, who find mystery and fresh beauty in what we call the commonplace. It is scarcely necessary to say that Riley was aboard the next schooner bound south for the islands. Nukuhiva knew him for a time, but the gloom and tragedy of that land, together with an episode of domestic infidelity, were overpowering to a man of his temperament. From the Marquesas he went to Tahiti, and his wanderings ended in the Cook group, 600 miles to the west. Perhaps the finding of his journey's end wrought the change. Perhaps it was due to his rather practical Tahitian wife. In any case, the wanderer ceased to rove. The spendthrift began to save and plan. In the groups to the eastward he had picked up a smattering of coconut lore. It was not long before he got a berth as superintendent of a small plantation. With a native wife and the Irishman's knack for language, he soon mastered the dialect of his group. He is one of a very few men who speak it with all the finer shadings. This accounts in part for his success with labor, the chief difficulty of the planter throughout Polynesia. To one interested as I am in the variations of this oceanic tongue, it is a genuine pleasure to talk with Riley. In school he learned to read and write. Beyond that he is entirely self-educated. A good half of his earnings, I should say, in the days when he followed the sea, were spent on books. A native intelligence enabled him to criticize and select. He has read enormously, and what he has read he has remembered. Each time a new subject attracted him, he hastened to the bookshops in San Francisco, or Liverpool, or Singapore, and gathered a little forecastle library of reference. Like most intelligent men in this part of the world, he has grown interested in the subject of Polynesian research. It is odd to hear him discuss, with strong accent of South Boston and the manner of a professor of etymology, some question of Maori chronology, or the variations in a causative prefix. Once he made clear to me a matter often referred to in print, but which I had never properly understood. He was speaking of the language of Tahiti. "When you hear a Tahitian talk," he said, "it sounds different, but really it's the same as Hawaiian or Manicaean or Rarotongan or New Zealand Maori. Tahiti is the oldest settled place, and the language has kind of rotted away there. Nowadays the Tahitian has lost the strong harsh sounds of the old lingo, the k and the ng. In place of them there is simply a catch between two vowels. If you know Rarotongan and understand the system of change, you can get on all right in Tahiti. Take our word alagangi, to play a musical instrument. Tangi means wail or weep. Aka is the old causative prefix. The combination means cause to weep. Now let's figure that word out in Tahitian. First we've got to take out the k and the ng. That leaves a bad start. It doesn't sound good. So the Tahitians stick on an F at the beginning. That's all there is to it. Fatahi is the word. It makes me laugh to think of when I first came down here. I was working in Tahiti, and when I came home in the evening, my girl would look up from her sewing and sing out, "O'Reilly." "For the love of Mike," I'd tell her, "don't you know my name yet? It's Riley, not O'Reilly." Finally I caught on. I'd been fooled on the same proposition as Cook and all the rest of them. You remember they called the island Otaheite? That O is simply a special form of the verb used before personal pronouns and proper names. The old navigators, when their canoes came out to meet them, pointed to the land and asked its name. "Otaheite," said the natives. "It is Tahiti." My girl didn't mean to call me O'Reilly at all. She was simply saying, "It's Riley." A serious white man, particularly when he is able to recruit and handle native labor, is always in demand in the islands. It was not long before Riley's talents were recognized. Now he is manager and part owner of an entire atoll. I have listened with a great deal of interest to his accounts of life there. Every year at about Christmas time a schooner comes to load his copra and take his boys back to their respective islands. Not a soul is left on the atoll. Riley boards the schooner with his wife and takes passage to Papeete for a couple of months of civilization. When the time is up, he makes a tour of the Cook group to recruit 20 or 30 boys for the new season, and is landed on his island with a 9-month supply of medicine, provisions, and reading matter. He is the only white man on the atoll. One would suppose such a life deadly monotonous and lonely. But just now he is pining to get back. It is really the pleasantest of lives, he says. Enough routine in keeping the men properly at work, superb fishing when one desires a touch of sport, plenty of time to read and think, the healthiest climate in the world, and a bit of trouble now and then to give the spice a true Irishman needs. Riley is a man of medium size, with thick brown hair and eyes of Celtic dark blue, perpetually sparkling with humor. I have never seen a stronger or more active man of his weight. In all his atoll he spends an hour every day in exercise, running, jumping, working with dumbbells and Indian clubs. From head to foot he is burnt a deep, ruddy brown, a full shade darker than the tint of his native wife. Sometimes, he says, he works himself into such a pink of condition that he aches to pick a fight with the first comer, but I fancy he finds trouble enough to satisfy another man. Once a huge Selman fellow from the Gambier group attempted to spear him, and Riley called all of his men in from their work, appointed the foreman referee, and beat the 220-pound native, fierce and lithe and strong as a tiger, slowly and scientifically to a pulp. On another occasion a half-savage boy from a far-off island of the southern Paumotus took a grudge against the manager and bided his time with the cunning of a wild animal. The chance came one afternoon when Riley was asleep in the shade behind his house. The Paumotan stole up with a club and put him still sounder asleep with a blow on the head that laid his scalp open and nearly fractured his skull. Half a dozen kicks from the ball of a toughened foot stove in the ribs on one side of his chest. With that the native left his victim, very likely thinking him dead. Riley's wife, from whom I got the story, was asleep in the house at the time. Toward evening she went to look for her husband, and found him stretched out, bloody and unconscious, on the sand. In spite of her agitation, her kind are not much use in a crisis, she managed to get him to the house and revive him. Riley's first act was to drink half a tumbler of whiskey, his second to send for the foreman. The Paumotan boy had disappeared. Overcome by forebodings of evil, he had taken canoe and paddled off to hide himself on an uncleared islet across the lagoon. Riley gave the foreman careful instructions. Early in the morning he was to take all the boys and spend the day, if necessary, in running down the fugitive, who under no circumstances was to be injured or roughly handled. They brought the boy in at noon, deathly afraid at first, sullen and revived when he learned his punishment was no worse than to stand up to the manager before the assembled plantation hands. It must have been a grievous affair. Tatuna could scarcely describe it without tears. Riley was still sick and dizzy. His ribs were taped so tightly that he could breathe with only half his lungs, and a 2-inch strip of plaster covered the wound on his head. The Paumotan was fresh and unhurt. He outweighed his antagonist by 20 pounds, and fought with confidence and bitterness. The Kanaka is certainly among the strongest men of the world, a formidable adversary in a rough-and-tumble fight. It went badly with Riley for a time. The boy nearly threw him, and a blow on his broken ribs almost made him faint. But in the end, maddened by pain and the thought of the treacherous attack, he got his man down, and might have killed him if the foreman and half a dozen others had not intervened. Riley's Island is a true atoll, a broad lagoon enclosed by an oval sweep of reef, along which are scattered islets of varying size. Many people must have lived on it in the past. Everywhere there are traces of man's occupation. A dozen inhabitants were there within the memory of living men, but the dead outnumbered the living too heavily. The place became unbearable to them, and in the end a schooner took them away. The Outland-Klook Islands are places full of interest. I determined, when I began this letter, to give you a real account of Mauke, the island itself, its people, the number of tons of copra produced annually, and other enlightening information. But somehow, when one begins to write of this part of the world, it seems a hopeless task to stick to a train of facts. There are too many diverging lines of fancy, too many intangible stimuli to thought, stirring to the imagination. Our landing at Mauke was a ticklish business. Like Mangaia, Mataro, and Etu, this island is of mixed volcanic and raised coral origin, the pinnacle of a submerged peak, ringed with millions of tons of coral, and without any lagoon worthy of the name. The polyps have built a sort of platform around the island, low inshore and highest, as it seems usually the case, just before it drops off into the sea. Branching across the outer ridge, the surf fills a narrow belt of shallows between it and the shore. The result is a miniature edition of a lagoon, a place of rocky pools where children wade knee-deep on the lookout for crayfish and baby octopus. On the outer edge of the reef is steep too, dropping off almost at the perpendicular. It is difficult to realize, when one has been brought up on the friendly coast of America, that if a boat capsizes off these reefs, one must swim offshore and wait to be picked up; that it is wiser to chance the sharks than to attempt a landing in the surf, for the sea is breaking along the summit of a sunken cliff, jagged and sharp as broken glass, poisonous as the venom of a snake. They came out to us in a whaleboat. Riley, the supercargo, and I were the first to go ashore. As we pulled away from the schooner, a high-pitched argument began. One of the principal men of the island had come out as a passenger and was sitting beside me. He insisted that as they had got off safely from the boat passage, it was best to return the same way. The boat steerer disagreed. It was all very well to put out from the passage with a score of men to hold the boat until the moment came, and launch her out head on to the breakers. But now the situation was different. The passage was narrow. It must be entered just so, and a mishap might have unpleasant consequences in such a surf. The steersman had the best of it. He took us a quarter of a mile beyond the passage, and let his men rest on their oars off a place where the reef seemed a little lower than elsewhere. Each time we swung up to the crest of a swell, I got a look at the surf, and the prospect was not reassuring. Once or twice, as the backwash poured off in a frothy cascade, I caught a glimpse of the coral, reddish black, jagged and forbidding. Little by little we drew near the land until the boat lay just where the waves began to tower for the final rush. The oarsman backed water gently. The boat steerer turned his head nervously this way and that, glancing at the reef ahead and at the rearing water behind. I thought of a day many years before when my father had taken me for a first experience of the chutes, and our little boat seemed to pause for an instant at the summit of the tower before it tilted forward and flew down the steep slope to the water, infinitely far off and below. The feeling was the same, fear mingling with delight and almost painful exhilaration. All of us, saving the watchful eye in the stern, were waiting for a signal which would make the oarsman leap into activity. The passengers clenched their teeth and gripped the rail. Suddenly it came, a harsh shout. 6 oars struck the water at once. A whaleboat gathered way. A big sea rose behind us, lifted us gently on its back, and swept us toward the reef. Next moment I saw we had started a breath too late. We were going like the wind, it was true, but not tilted forward on the crest as we should have been. The wave was gradually passing beneath us. Riley glanced at me and shook his head with a humorous turn down of the mouth. It was too late to stop. The men were pulling desperately, their long oars bending at every stroke. When the sea broke, we were slipping down into the trough behind. As we passed over the edge of the reef, the wave was beginning its backward wash. There were shouts. I found myself up to my waist in a foaming rush of water, struggling with might and main to keep my footing and hold the boat from slipping off into the sea. We stopped her just on the brink. Her keel grated on the coral. Another sea was coming at us, towering high above our heads. Riley, the supercargo, and I leaped aboard in response to a sharp command. The boys held her stern to the last. As they scrambled over the sides, the sea caught us, half swamping the boat and lifting her stern high in the air. She tilted wildly as her bow crashed on the coral, but a rare piece of luck saved her from turning broadside on. Next moment we were over the reef and gliding smoothly into the shallow water beyond. As I drew a long, satisfying breath, I heard Riley chuckle. "I think I'll get a job diving for shell," he remarked. "I'll swear I haven't breathed for a good 3 minutes." When we stood on the beach, a dozen men came forward, smiling, to greet their friend Riley. With a decently pronounceable name from the native standpoint, Riley has got off easily. I never tire of wondering what these people will call a white man. They seem to prefer the surname if it can be pronounced. If not, they try the given name, and Charlie becomes Terry or Johnny Tioni. If this fails, or they take a dislike to one, the fun begins. I have a friend who, unless he leaves the islands, will be called salt pork all his life, and I know another man, a second-rate colonial of the intolerant kind, who goes blissfully about his business all unaware that hundreds of people know him by no other name than pig dung. No doubt you have noticed another thing down here, the deceptive simplicity of address. In these eastern islands the humblest speaks to the most powerful without any title of respect, with nothing corresponding to our Mr. or Sir. At first one is inclined to believe that there is the beautiful and ideal democracy, the realization of the communist dream. And there are other things which lead to the same conclusion. Servants, for one example, are treated with extraordinary consideration and kindness. When the feast is over, the mistress of the household is apt as not to dance with the man who feeds her pigs, or the head of the family to take the arm of the girl who has been waiting on his guests. The truth is that this impression of equality is false. There are not many places in the world where a more rigid social order exists, not of caste, but of classes. In the 1,000 or 1,500 years that they have inhabited the islands, the Polynesians have worked out a system of human relationships nearer their ultimate, perhaps, than our own idealist would have us believe. Wealth counts for little, birth for everything. It is useless for an islander to think of raising himself in a social way, where he is born or dies, and his children after him. On the other hand, except for the abstract pleasure of position, there is little to make the small man envious of the great. He eats the same food, his dress is the same, he works as little or as much, and the relations between the two are of the pleasantest. There is a really charming lack of ostentation on these islands, where everything is known about everyone, and it is useless to pretend to be what one is not. That is at the root of it all. Here is one place in the world, at least, where every man is sure of himself. We were strolling up the path between the canoe houses when Riley stopped me. "Come and have a look," he said. "This is the only island I know of where you can see an old-fashioned double canoe." There were two of them in the shed we entered, under a roof, a battered galvanized iron, long, graceful hulls fashioned from the trunks of trees, joined in pairs by timbers of ironwood laid across the gunwales and lashed down with sinnet. They were beautifully finished, scraped smooth, and decorated with carving. In these craft, my companions told me, the men of Mauke still voyaged to Aitu and Minoto, as they had done for generations before Cook sailed through the group. There is an ancient feud between Mauke and Aitu. It is curious how hard such grudges die. The men of Aitu were the most warlike of all the Cook Islanders. Even in these times of traders and schools of missionaries, no firearms are allowed on the island. Time after time, in the old days, they raided Mauke, stealing by night upon the sleeping villages, entering each house to feel the heads of sleepers. When they felt the large head of a warrior, they seized his throat and killed him without noise. The children and women, the small heads and the heads with long hair, were taken back alive to Aitu. Terrible scenes have been enacted under the old ironwoods of Mauke, when the raiders, maddened with the heat of killing, danced in the firelight about the opened ovens and gorged on the bodies of the slain. For the Cook Islanders, excepting perhaps the people of Aitutaki, were cannibals as fierce as the Maoris of New Zealand, or the tawny savages of the Marquesas. Why should Aitutaki have bred a gentler and finer people? The group is not widely scattered as islands go. There must have been fighting and intermarriages for ages past. Yet any man who has been here long can tell you at a glance from which island a native hails. Even after my few weeks, I am beginning to have an eye for the differences. The Mangaian is typically the most distinct, recognizable at once by his dark skin, his wide, ugly mouth, his uncouth and savage manner. The full-blooded Rarotongan, who will soon be a rarity, is another type, handsome in a square-cut, liony way, with less energy and far more dignity of presence. The people of Aitutaki are different still, fair as the average Tahitian, and pleasing in features and manner. I have seen girls from that island who would be called beautiful in any country. These differences are not easy to account for, it seems to me, when one considers that the islanders are all of one race, tracing their ancestry back to common sources and speaking a common tongue. The trader, a friend of Riley's, took us to his house for lunch. The day was Sunday, and a feast was already preparing, so we were spared the vocal agonies of the pig. Times must be changing. I have seen very few traders of the gin-drinking type one expects to find in the South Seas. Nowadays they seem to be rather quiet, reflective men, who like to read and play their phonographs in the evening, and drink excellent whisky with soda from a sparklet bottle. This one was no exception. I found him full of intelligence and a dreamy philosophy which kept him content in this forgotten corner of the world. He was young and English. There were cricket bats and blazers in his living room, and shelves filled with the kind of books one can read over and over again. He was pessimistic over Riley's chances of getting men. The people of Mauke were drawing lazier each year, he said, and seemed to get along with less and less of the European things for which at one time they had worked. As for copra, they no longer bothered much with it. The nuts were left to sprout under the palms. The taro patches were running down, the coffee and breadfruit dropped off the trees unpicked. The oranges, which brought a good price when a vessel came to take them off, were allowed to drop and rot. As we sat smoking after lunch, a native boy came in with a vague air of conspiracy to hold a whispered conversation with Riley. When he had gone, the American turned to our host and winked at me. "There's a beer tub going full blast out in the bush," he said. "I think I'll drop in on them and see if I can pick up a man or two. You'd better come along." Liquor is prohibited to the natives throughout the Cook Islands. Even the white man must buy it from the government in quantities regulated by the judgment of the official in charge. The manufacture of anything alcoholic is forbidden, but this latter law is administered with a certain degree of tolerance. Fortunately for everyone concerned, the art of making palm toddy has never been introduced. When the Cook Islander feels the need of mild exhilaration, he takes to the bush and brews a beverage known as orange beer. The ingredients are sugar, orange juice, and yeast. The recipe would prove popular, I fancy, in our own orange-growing states. The story goes that when the Cook Island boys went overseas to war, they found a great drought prevailing in their eastern field of action. Palestine, I think it was. But there were oranges in plenty, and these untutored islanders soon showed the Tommies a trick that brought them together like brothers. I have tasted orange beer at all stages, even the rare old vintage stuff, bottled 2 or 3 months before, and found it not at all difficult to take. There are worse varieties of tipple, though this one is apt to lead to fighting, and leaves its too enthusiastic devotee with a headache of unusual severity. We found 15 or 20 men assembled under an old utu tree. A dance ended as we drew near, and the cup was being passed. 2 5-gallon kerosene tins, with the top cut off and filled with the bright yellow beer, stood in the center of the group. Women are never present on these occasions, which corresponds in a way to Saturday evenings in a club at home. A sort of rude ceremonial, a relic perhaps of kava-drinking days, is observed around the beer tub. The oldest man present, armed with a heavy stick, is appointed guardian of the peace, to see that decency and order are preserved. The natives realize, no doubt, that any serious disturbance might put an end to their fun. The single cup is filled and passed to each guest in turn. He must empty it without taking breath. After every round, one of the drinkers is expected to rise and entertain the company with a dance or song. Riley was welcomed with shouts. He was in a gay mood, and when we had our turns at the cup, he stripped off his tunic for a dance. He is a famous dancer. Unhampered by the native conventions, he went through the figures of Hiera, Oya, and Ura. First the man's part, then the woman's, while the men of Maki clapped their hands rhythmically and choked with laughter. No wonder Riley gets on with the people. There is not an ounce of self-consciousness in him. He enters into a bit of fun with the good-natured abandon of a child. As for dancing, he is wonderful. Every posture was there, every twist and wiggle and flutter of the hands, what old Bligh called, with delightful, righteous gusto, the wanton gestures of the Hebrea. Riley had told his friends on the beach that he was on the lookout for labor. By this time, probably the whole island knew he was on his way to the atoll and that he needed men. Before we took leave of the drinkers, 3 of them had agreed to go with my companion. The sea was calmer now, and since Riley's wife was on the schooner, we decided to go aboard for dinner. 4 more recruits were waiting by the canoe houses to sign on. It was odd to see their response to the Irishman's casual offer when half the planters of the group declare that labor is unobtainable. The whaleboat was waiting in the passage. It was evening. The wind had dropped. The sky overhead was darkening. Out to the west the sun had set behind banks of white cloud rimmed with gold. The oarsmen took their places. Friendly hands shot us out on a lull between 2 breakers. We passed the surf and pulled offshore toward where the schooner was riding an easy swell, her lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. End of chapter 5. Faery Lands of the South Seas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mike Vendetti. Chapter 6. Rutiaro. Chance began to move of set purpose in Papeete on the day I was to sail with the 110-ton schooner Caleb S. Winship for the Cloud of Islands. I was on my way to the waterfront, and having plenty of time, walked leisurely, thinking of the long journey so nearly at hand, of the strange and lonely islands I was to see, and wondering, as an Anglo-Saxon must when presented with a piece of good fortune, what I had done to merit it. Oro, the cabin boy of the Winship, was following with my luggage. He kept at some distance, a mark of respect, as I thought, until I saw him sublet his contract to a smaller boy. Then he retired to spend the unearned increment in watermelon and a variety of cakes sold at the Chinese stalls along the street. Not wanting him to think that I begrudged him his last little fling on shore, I became interested of a sudden in the contents of a shop window, and there I saw a box full of marbles. In a moment Oro was forgotten. Papeete faded from view, and the warm air, fragrant with the odors of vanilla and roasting coffee, became more bracing. There was a tang in it, like that of early April in Iowa, for example, at the beginning of the marble-playing season. 15 years dropped lightly from my shoulders, and I was back at the old rendezvous in the imagination, almost as really as I had ever been in the flesh. The lumber yard of S. M. Brown and Son lay on the right hand, and the Rock Island Railroad tracks on the left. Between, on a stretch of smooth cinder right-of-way, a dozen games were in full swing. There were cries of picks and vents, bunchers, sneakers, knucks down, the sharp crack of expert shots, the crunch of cinders under bare and yet tender feet. Meadowlarks were singing in a nearby pasture, and from afar I heard the deep whistle of the Rocky Mountain Limited as it came down the Mitchell grade. I bought the marbles, the whole box of them. They cost 50 francs, about $4 American, as the exchange was then, but I considered the investment a good one. I knew that no matter where I might be, to lift the lid of my box was to make an immediate and inexpensive journey back to one of the pleasantest periods of my boyhood. Oro was awaiting me at the quay, and carried my small sea-chest on board with an air of spurious fatigue. I gave him my purchase, and told him to stow it away for me in the cabin, which he did with such care that I did not find it again until we were within view of Rutiaro. The Caleb S. Winship was homeward bound then. From Tanao, where we had left Crichton, the English planter, Rutiaro lying on our course, it was decided to put in there, in the hope that we might be able to replace our lost deck cargo of copra, washed overboard in a squall a few days previously. Neither Findlay's South Pacific Directory nor the British Admiralty's sailing directions had much to say about the atoll. Both agreed that the lagoon is 9 miles long by 5 broad, and that on June 29, 1887, the French surveying vessel St. Etienne found the tide running through a narrow pass at 2 knots per hour, the flood as swift as the ebb. It was further stated that in 1889 Her Majesty's ship Prince Edward anchored in 8 fathoms, 300 yards from shore, in front of the village, which is situated on the most westerly island, and from that a few pigs and chickens were purchased at a nominal price from the inhabitants. With this information I had to be content in so far as my reading was concerned. There was nothing of a later date in either volume, and the impression I had was that the atoll, having been charted and briefly described, had remained unvisited, almost forgotten, for a period of 31 years. This, of course, was not the case. Tinned beef and kerosene oil had followed the flag there as elsewhere in the world. Religion, in fact, had preceded it, leaving a broad wake of Bibles and black Mother Hubbards still in evidence among the older generation. But skippers of small trading schooners are rarely correspondents of the hydrographic associations, and the reports from the field of itinerant missionaries are buried in the dusty files of the religious journals, so that Rutiaro is as little known to the world at large as it has always been. Findlay's general remarks about it were confined to a single sentence: a lonely atoll, numbering a population of between 75 and 100 inhabitants. It certainly looked lonely enough on the chart, far out on the westerly fringe of the archipelago, more than 600 miles from the nearest steamship route, and that one infrequently traveled. I sought further information from Tino Atino, the supercargo, a 3/4 American despite his Tahitian name. He had been trading in the Low Islands for 20 years, and during that time had created a voluminous literature with reference to their inhabitants. But it was all of an occupational nature and confined to the ledgers of the Inter-Island Trading Company. I found him at his usual task in the cabin, where he gave me some specimen compositions for criticism. "I wish you'd look them over," he said. "These copra bugs drive a man wild. They get in your eyes, in your liquor, in your mouth. Lord, what a life!" The cabin was filled with unsacked copra to the level of the upper tier of bunks. One had to crawl on hands and knees. The copra bugs were something of a nuisance, and the smell and heat oppressive. I had traveled on more comfortable vessels with tennis courts on the boat decks and Roman swimming baths below, but they didn't touch at Rutiaro. I went through his accounts, verifying long list of items such as: to Taritutu, DR, 1 dozen beacon lanterns at 480 francs, 480. To Uhaiti Punts, DR, 12 sacks lily dust flour at 300 francs, 3600. To Lohongchen, DR, 1 gross Night King flash lamps at 3600 francs, 3600. The work of checking up finished, we went out for a breath of air. The atoll lay abeam, and still far distant a faint bluish haze lifted a bare eighth of an inch above the circle of the horizon. Behind us, rain fell in a straight wall of water from a single black cloud which cast a deep shadow over the path we had come. Elsewhere the sky was clear, and the sea the incredible blue of the tropics. Tino broke a long silence. "Look here," he said. "What is it that interests you in these islands? I have never known anyone to visit them for pleasure before. Is it the women, or what?" Under pressure I admitted that nature seemed to have spent her best effort among the Paumotuans in fashioning the men. "You're right," said Tino. "The women are healthy enough, of course, but they don't set your heart beating 100 to a minute. They have fine hands and white teeth, and you won't find such black hair in all the world as you'll find in these atolls. But that's the size of it. You can't praise them any further for looks. Maybe you haven't noticed their ears, because they always cover them up with their hair. But they're large, and their feet and ankles tough as sole leather, and all scarred over with coral cuts. That is well enough for the men, but with the women it's different. Makes you lose your enthusiasm, don't it? I had seen a good many striking exceptions in our wanderings, but I had agreed in the main what he said was true. Well, if it ain't the women, what else is there to be interested in? Not the island themselves, Lord. When you've seen one, you've seen on the lot. Living on one of them is like living aboard ship. Not room to stretch your legs. They're solid enough, and they don't sink. But in a hurricane, I'd a heap rather take my chances out to sea with the Winship than to be lashed to the stoutest coconut tree in the whole group. Now you take Rutiaro. It was washed over 17 years ago, and all but 20 of the people killed. They are back to 75 now, but wait till the next bad blow down the way. They'll drown like rats, just as they did before. Well, we don't have to stop long, he added grouchily. I'll take what copra they have and get out. It's a godforsaken hole. They only make about 25 tons a year. The island could produce 3 times that amount under decent management. They're a lazy, independent lot at Rutiaro. You can't get 'em to stir themselves. I asked him what they had to gain by stirring themselves. Gain? He said. They have everything to gain. There are 2 frame houses on the place. The rest of them are miserable little shelters of coconut thatch. I haven't sold them enough corrugated iron in 10 years to cover this cockpit. You remember Takura and Niue and Fakumiya? Well, there's my idea of islands. Nice European furniture, iron beds, center tables, phonographs, bicycles. A further catalogue of the comforts and conveniences of civilization which the inhabitants of Rutiaro might have and didn't, convinced me that this was the atoll I had been looking for, and I regretted that our stay here was to be so brief. I did not begrudge the inhabitants of richer atolls their phonographs and bicycles. They got an incredible amount of amusement out of them, listened with delight to the strange music, and spent entire evenings taking turns with the bicycles, riding them back and forth from the lagoon beach to the ocean shore. But the frame houses were blots on the landscape, crude, barn-like structures, most of them which offended the eye like factory chimneys in a green valley. Rutiaro had none of these things, and having no interest in it from the commercial point of view, I awaited impatiently our arrival there. At 10 o'clock we were 3 miles to windward of the village island. It lay at the narrower end of the lagoon, the inner shoreline curving around a broad indentation where the village was. The land narrowed in one direction to a ledge of reef. At the further end there was a small motu, not more than 300 yards in length by 100 broad, separated from the main island by a strip of shallow water. Seen from aloft, the 2 islands resembled roughly in outline an old-fashioned, high-pooped vessel with a small boat in tow. I could see the whole of the atoll from the mainmast cross-trees, the lagoon shimmering into green over the shoals, darkening to an intense blue over unlit valleys of ocean floor, a solitude of sunlit water, placid as a lake buried in the depths of inaccessible mountains. I followed the shoreline with my glasses. Distant islands, ledges of barren reef, leaped forward with an effect of magic, as though our atom of a vessel, the only sail which relieved the emptiness of the sea, had been swept in an instant to within a few yards of the surf. Great combers, green and ominous-looking in the sunlight, broke at one rapidly advancing point, toppled and fell in segments, filling the inner shadows with a smother of foam. Beyond it lay the broad fringe of white, deserted beach, the narrow forest of shrubs and palm, the empty lagoon, a border of misty islands on the further side. I had seen the same sort of a picture 20 times before, always with the same keen sense of its desolate beauty, its allurement, its romantic loveliness. Tino had said, When you've seen one, you've seen them all, and an old skipper once told me that the atolls are as much alike as the reef points on that sail. It is true. They are as monotonous as the sea itself, and as fresh with varying interest. The village was hidden among the trees, but I saw the French flag flying near a break in the reef, which marked the landing place for small boats. Further back, a little knot of people were gathered, some of them sitting in the full glare of the sun, others in the deep shade, leaning against the trees in attitudes of dreamy meditation. 3 girls were combing their hair, talking and laughing in an animated way. They were dressed in all their European finery, gowns of flowered muslin pulled up around their bare legs to prevent soilure. A matronly woman in a red wrapper had thrown the upper covering aside and sat naked to the waist, nursing a baby. I put down my glasses, feeling rather ashamed of my scrutiny, as though I had been peeping through a window at some intimate domestic scene. The island leaped into the distance. The broad circle of foam and jagged reef narrowed to a thread of white, and the Caleb S. Winship crept landward again under a light breeze, an atom of a ship on a vast and empty sea. 8 bells struck, a tinkling sound, dead and scarcely audible in the wide air. I heard Tino's voice as though coming from an immense distance. "Hello, up there! Carry Khan's ready," I said. "All right, I'm coming," and was surprised at the loudness of my own shout. But I waited for a moment to indulge myself in a last reflection. It is 31 years since the Prince Edward put in here. Excepting a few traders and missionaries, there isn't probably one man in 100,000 who has ever heard of this atoll, not one in a million who has ever seen it, or ever will see it. What a piece of luck for me! Then I saw Oro at the galley door with a huge platter of boiled beef and sweet potatoes. The sight of it reminded me that I was very hungry. As I climbed down to the deck, I was conscious of the fact that a healthy appetite and a good digestion were a piece of luck, too, and that as long as one could hold it, the lure of islands would remain, and one's love of living burn with a clear flame. Jack the monkey seemed to divine my thought, to agree with it. As Oro, the food-bearer, passed him, he reached down from his perch in the rigging, seized the largest sweet potato on the platter, and clambered out of reach. Assured of his safety, he fell to greedily looking out wistfully toward the island. The pass was at the further end of the lagoon, and in order to save time in getting the work ashore under way, the supercargo and I, with 3 of the sailors, put off in the whaleboat to land on the ocean side of the village. 6 men rushed into the surf, seized and held the boat as the backwash poured down the stern incline at the edge of the reef. Among them was the chief, a man of huge frame, 6 foot 2 or 3 in height. Like the others who assisted at the landing, he was clad only in a pareu, but he lost none of his dignity through his nakedness. He was 55 years old, as I afterward learned, and as he stood bidding us welcome, I thought of the strange appearance certain of the chief men in America or France or England would make under similar circumstances. Deprived of the kindly concealment of clothing, what a revelation it would be of skinniness or pudginess! What an exhibition of scrawny necks, fat stomachs, flat chests, flabby arms! To be strictly accurate, I had seen some fat stomachs among elderly Palmyrans, but they were exceptions, and always remarkable for that reason, and those who carried them had sturdy legs. They did not give one the uneasy feeling common at home at the sight of the great paunches of sedentary men toppling unsteadily along a strip of crimson carpet from curb to curb doorway. Wherever one goes in Polynesia, one is reminded, by contrast, of the cost physically to men of our own race of our sheltered way of living. There on every hand are men well past middle life, with compact, symmetrical bodies and the natural grace of healthy children. One sees them carrying immense burdens without exertion, swimming in the open sea for an hour or 2 at a time while spearing fish, loafing ashore with no greater apparent effort for yet longer periods. Sometimes, when they have it, they eat enormous quantities of food at one sitting, and at others under necessity as sparingly as so many dyspeptics. It would be impossible to formulate from their example any rules for rational living in more civilized communities. The daily quest for food under primitive conditions keeps them alert and sound of body, so that, whether they work or loaf, feast or fast, they seem always to acquire health by it. There had been no boats at Rutiaro in 5 months, and the crowd on the beach was unfeigningly glad to see us. The arrival of a schooner at that remote island was an event of great importance. The sight of new faces lighted their own with pleasure, which warmed the heart toward them at once. We had brought ashore a consignment of goods for Moy Ling, the Chinese storekeeper, and when the handshaking was over they gathered around it as eagerly as a group of American children at a Christmas tree. Even the village constable seemed unconscious of any need for a show of dignity or authority. The only badge of his office was a cigarette-card picture of President Poincaré, fastened with a safety pin to his old felt hat. He neglected his duties as a keeper of order, and was one of the most excited of Moy Ling's helpers with the cargo. He kept patting him affectionately on the back, saying, "Mutiny, Mutiny," which in that situation may be as freely translated as, "You know me, Moy Ling." And the old Chinaman smiled, the pleasant, non-committal smile of his countrymen the world over. Tino's was the only sour face on the beach. He moved through the crowd, giving orders, grumbling and growling, half to himself and half to me. "I told you they were a lazy lot," he said. "They've seen us making in for 3 hours, and what have they been doing? Loafing on the beach, waiting for us instead of getting their copra together. Moy Ling is the only one in the village who is ready to do business. 5 tons, all sacked for weighing. He's worth a dozen Kanakas. Well, I'll set 'em to work in quick time now. You watch me. I'm going to be loaded and out of here by 6 o'clock." But chance, using me as an innocent accomplice, ordered it otherwise. It was Sir Thomas Browne who said, "Those who hold that all things are governed by fortune had not erred had they not persisted there." He may be right, although I don't remember now where his own non-persistence lay. But there are some things, some events, which chance of fortune, whatever one wishes to call it, governs from the outset with an amazing show of omnipotence. Tracing them back, one becomes almost convinced of a fixed intent, a far-sighted, unwavering determination in its apparently haphazard functioning. It is clear to me now that because I had been fond of playing marbles as a boy, I was to be marooned 15 years later on a fragment of land 6,000 miles from the lumber yard of S. M. Brown & Son. Tino had no more to do with that result than I did. He merely lost his temper because chance disorganized his plans for an early departure, tried to quench his anger in rum, and because, more furious still because he was drunk, then off he went in the Caleb S. Winship, leaving me stranded ashore. I can hear his parting salutation, which he roared at me through a megaphone across the starlit lagoon. "You can stay." But this is anticipating. The story moves in a more leisurely fashion. As I have said, my box of marbles came to light again only a few hours before we reached Rutiaro. I took them ashore with me, thinking they might amuse the children. They had a good knowledge of the technique of shooting, acquired in a two-handed game common among the atolls, which is played with bits of polished coral. But theirs had always seemed to me a tame pastime, lacking the interest of stakes to be won or lost. I instructed them in the simple rules of bull ring and Tom's dead, which they quickly mastered. Then I divided the marbles equally among them and gave them to understand that the winner held his gains, although marbles, like trade goods, might be bartered for. I emphasized that feature of the game because of a recollection remaining from my own marble-playing days, of the contempt in which boys were held who refused to hazard their marbles in a test of skill. They refused to play for keeps, and the rest of us had nothing to do with them. The youngsters of Rutiaro were not of that stamp. They took their losses in good part. When I saw that, I left them to themselves, and went for a walk through the village. I knew, at least I thought I did, that our stay was to be brief, and I wanted to make the most of it. I followed the street bordering the lagoon, past the freshly thatched houses with their entryways wide to the sun and wind, and came at length to a small burying ground, which lay in an area of green shadow far from the village. There were a dozen or more graves within the enclosure, some of them neatly mounded over with broken coral and white shell, others encased in a kind of sarcophagus of native cement to keep more restless spirits from wandering abroad. Most of them were unmarked. 2 or 3 had wooden headboards, one of which was covered with a long inscription in Chinese. Beneath this the word "Repose" was printed in English, as though it had some peculiar talismanic significance for the Chinaman who had placed it there. It was the grave of a predecessor of Moy Ling's. I fell to thinking of him as I sat there, and all of the Chinamen I had met in the earlier days, lonely, isolated figures, most of them without family or friends or the saving companionship of books. What was it that kept them going? What goal were they striving toward through lives which held so little of the comfort or happiness essential to the rest of humankind? Repose. A better end than that, surely. The air rang with the sound of the word. The garish sunlight fell pitilessly on the print of it. To most men, I believe, with the best of life still before them, there is something terrible, infamous, in the thought of the unrelieved blackness of an endless, dreamless sleep. I turned from the contemplation of it, let my thoughts wander in a mist of dreams, of half-formed fancies, which glimmered through consciousness like streaks of sunlight in a dusty attic. These vanished at length, and for a time I was as dead to thought or feeling as Moy Ling's predecessor, sleeping beside me. I was awakened by some one shaking me by the shoulder. A voice said, "Faery Tipati, come down to the boat," and a dark figure ran on before, turning from time to time to urge me to greater speed. It was almost night, although there was still light enough to see by. I remembered that Tino had told me to be at the copra sheds at 5. The tide would serve for getting through the pass until 8, but I hurried nevertheless, feeling that something unusual had happened. Rounding a point of land which cut off the view from the village and inner lagoon, I saw the schooner, about 300 yards offshore, slim and black against a streak of orange cloud to the northward. She was moving slowly out, under power. The whaleboat was being hoisted over the side, and at the wheel I saw the familiar silhouette of the supercargo. I shouted, "Hi, Tino, wait a minute! You're not going to leave me behind, are you?" A moment of silence followed. Then came the answer with the odd deliberation of utterance which I knew meant Tahiti rum. "You can stay there and play marbles till hell freezes over. I'm through with you." What had happened, as nearly as I could make out afterwards, was this. My box of marbles, which I had brought ashore for the amusement of the children, interested the grown-ups as well, particularly the hazard of stakes in the game I had shown them. Paumotuans have a good deal of Scotch acquisitiveness in their make-up. They coveted these marbles. They were really worth coveting, and it was not long until play became general, a family affair, the experts in one being pitted against those in another, regardless of age or sex. Tino's threats and entreaties had been to no purpose. All work had come to an end, and the only copra which got aboard the Winship was Moy Ling's 5 tons, carried out by the sailors themselves. Evidently, Puarei, the chief, had been one of the most enthusiastic players. He was not a man to be bulldozed or browbeaten. He had great dignity and force of character, for all his boyish delight in simple amusements. What right had Tino to say that he should not play marbles on his own island? He gave me to understand by means of gestures, intonation, and a mixture of French and Paumotuan, that this was what the supercargo had done. At least apparently Tino had sent Oro on an unsuccessful search for me. He thought, I suppose, that having been the cause of the marble-playing mania, I might be able and willing to check it. Balked there, he went on board in a fit of violent temper, and had not been seen again, although his voice was heard for an hour thereafter. Of a sudden anchor was weighed. and I was left, as he assured me, to play marbles with the inhabitants of Rachino for an impossibly long time. Most of these details I gathered afterward. At the moment I guessed just enough of the truth not to be wholly mystified. The watery sputtering of the Winship's 25-horsepower engine grew faint. Then, with a ghostly gleam of her mainsail in the starlight, she was going. I was thinking, by Jove, I wouldn't have missed this experience for all the copra in the cloud of islands. I was glad there were still adventures of that sort to be had in a humdrum world. It was so absurd, so fantastically unreal as to fit nothing but reality, and the event of it was exactly what I had wanted all the time without knowing it. There was no reason why I shouldn't stop at Rotariano. To be sure, I was shortly to have met my friend Nordhoff at Papeete, but our rendezvous was planned to be broken. We were wandering in the South Pacific as opportunity and inclination should direct, which, I take it, is the only way to wander. For a few moments I was so deeply occupied with my own thoughts that I was not conscious of what was taking place around me. All the village was gathered there, watching the departing schooner. As she vanished, a loud murmur ran through the crowd, like a sough of wind through trees, a long drawn-out Polynesian "Aye," indicative of astonishment, indignation, pity. Paumotuan sympathies are large, and I had been the victim of treachery, they thought, and was silently grieving at the prospect of a long exile. They gathered around, patting me on the back in their odd way, expressing their condolences as best they could. But I soon relieved their minds on that score. Then Huari, the constable with the cigarette-card insignia, pushed his way through with the first show of authority I had seen him make. "I been Frisco," he said, with an odd accent on the last syllable. He had made the journey once as a stoker on one of the mail boats. Then he added, "You go to hell me," his eyes shining with pride that he could be of service as a reminder of home to an exiled American. He was about to take charge of me in view of his knowledge of English, but the chief waved him away with a gesture of authority. I was to be his guest, he said, at any rate for the present. He began his duties as host by entertaining me at dinner at Moyling's store. I was a little surprised that we did not go to his house for the meal until I remembered that the Chinaman had received the only consignment of exotic food left by the Winship. Puarei ordered the feast with the discrimination of a gourmet and the generosity of a sailor on shore leave for the first time in months. We had smoked herring for hors d'oeuvres, followed by soup, curried chicken and rice, edible birds' nests flavored with crab meat from China, and white bread. For dessert we had small Chinese pears preserved in vinegar, which we ate out of the tin. Woman brand pears, the label said. There was a colored picture on it of a white woman in old-fashioned puff sleeves and a long skirt, seated in a garden, while a Chinaman served her deferentially with pears out of the same kind of a container. Underneath was printed in English, "These pears will be found highly stimulating. We respectfully submit them to our customers." That was the first evidence I had seen of China's bid for export trade in tinned fruit. Stimulating may have been just the word, but I liked the touch of Chinese courtesy which followed it. It didn't seem out of place, even coming from a canning factory. Puarei gave all his attention to his food, and consumed an enormous quantity. My own appetite was a healthy one, but I had not his capacity of stomach. Furthermore, he ate with his fingers, while I was handicapped from the first with a two-pronged fork and a small tin spoon. I believe they were the only implements of the sort on the island, for the village had been searched for them before they were found. It was another evidence to me of the unfrequented nature of Rutiaro, and of its slender contact even with this world of Papeete traders. At most of the islands we had visited, knives and forks were common, although rarely used except in the presence of strangers. The onlookers at the feast, about half the village, I should say, watched with interest my efforts to balance mouthfuls of rice on a two-pronged fork. I could see that they regarded it as a ridiculous proceeding. They must have thought Americans a strange folk, checking appetite and worrying digestion with such doubtful aids. Finally I decided to follow the chief's example, and set to with my fingers. They laughed at that, and Puarei looked up from his third plate of rice and chicken to nod approval. It was a strange meal, reminding me of stories I had read as a boy of Louis XV dining in public at Versailles, with a room full of visitors from foreign courts looking on, whispering behind fans and lace cuffs, exchanging awestruck glances at the splendor of the service, the richness of the food, and the sight of majesty fulfilling a need common to all humankind. There was no whispering among the crowd at the Chinaman's shop, no awestruck glances other than Moy Ling's at the majesty of Puarei's appetite. I felt sorry for him as he trotted back and forth from his outdoor kitchen, bringing in more food, thinking of his depleted stock, smiling with an expression of wan and worried amiability. Louis XV would have given something, I'll venture, for that old Paumotuan chief's zest for food, for the kingly weight of bone and muscle which demanded such a store of nourishment. He pushed back his chair at length with a sign of satisfaction, and a half-caste girl of 17 or 18 removed the empty dishes. Paumotuan hospitality is an easy, gracious thing, imposing obligations on neither host nor guest. Dinner over, I told Puarei that I wanted to take a walk, and he believed me. I was free at once, and I knew that he would not be worrying meanwhile about my entertainment. I would not be searched for presently and pounced upon with the dreaded, "See here, I'm afraid you are not having a good time," of the uneasy host. I was introduced to no one, dragged nowhere to see anything, free from the necessity of being amused. I might do as I liked, rare and glorious privilege, and I went outside, grateful for it, and for the cloak of darkness which enabled me to move about unobserved. It lifted here and there in the glow of supper fires or streak of yellow lamplight from an open doorway. I saw family groups gathered around their meals of fish and coconuts, heard the loud intake of breath as they sucked the Mai Tai sauce from their fingers. Dogs were splashing about in the shallows of the lagoon, seeking their own supper of fish. They are a strange breed, the dogs of the atolls, like no other that I have ever seen, a mixture of all breeds, one would think, a weird blending of good blood and bad. The peculiar environment and the strange diet have altered them so that they hardly seem dogs at all, but rather semi-amphibious animals, more at home in the sea than on land. They are gentle-mannered with their masters and with strangers, but fierce fighters among themselves. I sat down behind a clump of bushes, concealed from the light of one of the smoldering supper fires, and watched a group of Rotarian dogs in their search for food. They had developed a sort of teamwork in the business, leaped toward the shore all together with a porpoise-like curving of their bodies, and were quick as a flock of terns to see and seize their prey. Returning from my walk, I found the village street deserted, and all the people assembled back of Moy Ling's shop. He was mixing bread at a table while one of the sons of his strange family piled fresh fuel on the fire under a long brick oven. It was a great event, the bread-making, after long months of dearth, and of interest to everyone. Mats were spread within the circle of the firelight. Puarei was there with his wife, a mountain of a woman, seated at his side. She was dressed in red calico wrapper, and her long black hair fell in a pool of shadow on the mat behind her. She was a fit wife for a chief, in size, in energy, in the fire and spirit, living in the huge bulk of flesh. Her laughter came in a clear stream which it was a delight to hear. There was no undertone of foreboding or bitter remembrance, and the flow of it, as light-hearted as a child's, heightened the merry-making mood of the others. There was a babble of talk, bursts of song, impromptu dancing to the accompaniment of an accordion and the clapping of hands. As I looked on, I was minded of an account I had read of the Paumotuans, in which they were described as a dour people, silent, brooding, and religious. Religious some of them assuredly are, despite a good deal of evidence to the contrary, and they are often silent in the dreamy way of remote island people whose moods are drawn from the sea, whose minds lie fallow to the peace and beauty of it. But dour and brooding is very far from the truth. I took a place among them as quickly as possible, for I knew by repeated experience how curious they are about strangers, and first meetings were usually embarrassing. Without long training as a freak with a circus, it would try any man's courage to sit for an hour among a group of Paumotuans while he was being discussed item by item. There is nothing consciously brutal or callous in the manner of it, but rather an unreflecting frankness like that of children in the presence of something strange to their experience. I knew little of the language, although I caught a word here and there which indicated the trend of the comment. It was not general, fortunately, but confined to those on either side of me. Two old grandmothers started a speculation as to whether or not I had any children, and from this a discussion rose as to which of the girls of Rutiaro would be best suited as a wife for me. I was growing desperate when chance, the godfather of all wanderers, intervened again in my favor. Moy Ling's fire was burning brightly, and it occurred to several of the youngsters to resume their marble playing. I saw Perusi's face light with pleasure, and he was on his feet at once with his stake in the ring. Others followed, and soon all those who had marbles were in the sport. I understood clearly then how helpless Tino had been. I could easily picture him rushing from group to group, furious at the thought of his interest being neglected through such childish folly. Those marbles were more desirable than his flour and canned goods, which he stood ready to exchange for copra. The explanation of this astounding fact may have been that no one thought he would go off as he did, and tomorrow would do just as well for getting down to business. Since he had gone, there was an end of that. It was futile to worry about the lost food. Certainly it was forgotten during the great tournament which took place that evening. Moy Ling worked at his bread-making unnoticed. His fire died down to a heap of coals, but another was built, and the play went on. Faery was a splendid shot, in marble playing as in other respects, the best man of the village. But there was a slip of a girl who was even better. During the evening she accumulated nearly half of the entire marble supply, and at length these two met for a test of skill. It was a long drawn-out game. I had never seen anything to equal the interest of both players and spectators. Not even at Brown's lumber yard, when the stakes were a boy's most precious possessions, cornelian stone taws. No one thought of sleep except a few of the old men and women, who dozed off at intervals with their heads between their knees. The lateness of the hour, the bizarre setting for a game so linked with memories of boyhood, combined to give me an impression of unreality. I had the feeling that the island and all the people on it might vanish at any moment, and the roar of the surf resolve itself into the rumble of street traffic in some gray city. And though it were the very city where marbles are made, where in the length and breadth of it could there be found anyone who knew the use of them, with either the time or the inclination to play, I might search it street by street. To the soot-stained suburbs I might go on to the green country, perhaps, visit all the old-time marble-playing rendezvous from one coast to the other, with no better success. And though I passed through 1,000 villages of the size of Rutiaro, could at evening's amusement be provided in any one of them for men, women, and children, at an outlay of $4 American, the possibility would not be worth considering. People at home live too fast in these days, and they want too much. I could imagine Tino, in a sober mood, giving a grudging assent to this. "But, man," he would have added, "I wish they had more of their marble-making enthusiasm at Rutiaro. I would put in here 3 times a year, and fill the Winship with copra to within an inch of the main boom every trip." Moy Ling had enough of it for the whole island, it seemed to me. His ovens were opened as the tournament came to an end, and for half an hour he was kept busy passing out crisp brown loaves and jotting down the list of creditors in his account book. It must have been nearly midnight. The crowd began to disperse. Faery joined me, smiling ruefully, holding out empty hands. He had lost all of his marbles to a mite of a girl whom he could have put in his vest pocket had he owned one. His wife teased him about it on the way home, laughed heartily at his explanation and excuses. They discussed the events of the day long after the other members of the household had retired to their mats on the veranda. At last I heard their quiet breathing, and a strip of light from the last quarter moon revealed them asleep, two massive heads on the same pillow. I lay awake for a much longer time, thinking of one thing and another, of my friend Crichton at Tanao, the loneliest atoll in the world, I should say, of the Winship far out to sea, homeward bound, with 140 tons of copra in her hold, of Tino with his fits of temper and his passion for trade which blinded him to so much of the beauty and the joy of life. But after all, I thought, it is men like Tino who keep wheels turning and boats traveling the seas. If he were to die, his loss would be felt. There would be an eddy in the current of life around him. But men like Crichton or myself, we should go down in our time, and the broad stream would flow over our heads without a ripple to show where we had been, without a bubble rising to the surface to carry with it for a moment the memory of our lives. It was not a comforting thought, and I tried to evade it. But I realized that my New England conscience was playing a part in these reflections, and was not to be soothed in any such childish manner. "How much copra have you ever produced or carried to market?" it appeared to say. I admitted that the amount was negligible. "How do you mean to justify your presence here?" was the next question, and before I could think of a satisfactory answer, "What good will come of this experience, either to yourself or to anyone else?" That was a puzzler until I happened to think of Findlay's South Pacific Directory. I remembered that his information about Rutiaro was very scant. The general remarks confined, as I have already said, to a single sentence: a lonely atoll, numbering a population of between 75 and 100 inhabitants. As a sop to my conscience, it occurred to me that I might write to the publishers of that learned work, suggesting that, in the light of recent investigations, they add to that description, "fond of playing marbles." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Faery Lands of the South Seas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Chapter 7. A Debtor of Moy Ling. Puarei's house stood halfway down the village street at Rutiaro, facing a broad indentation from the lagoon. The Catholic church adjoined it on one side, the Protestant church on the other. Neither of them was an imposing structure, but they towered above the small frame dwelling of the chief with an air of projection, of jealous watchfulness. On sunny days they shaded his roof in turn, and when it rained, poured over it streams of water through lead pipes projecting from their own ampler roofs, a purely utilitarian function, since the drainage from the three buildings furnished the fresh water supply of the settlement. If the showers were light, the overflow from the largest of the rival churches, splashing on the sheets of corrugated iron, filled the house with a monotonous murmur, like the drowsy argument of two soft-voiced missionaries. But during a heavy downpour, the senses were stunned by the incessant thunder, as though one were enclosed in an immense drum, beaten with non-sectarian vigor by all the Salvation Armies in the world. It was during such a deluge one day in early spring that I lay on the guest bed in Puarei's one-room house, watching Poura, his wife, who had washed my linen with her own hands and was then ironing it. It was not, strictly speaking, linen. The articles were three: a sleeveless gauze singlet, a cotton handkerchief, and a faded khaki shirt. A pair of khaki trousers, a pair of canvas tennis shoes, and a pandanus hat completed my wardrobe. Since I needed the whole of it when going abroad about the island, it was necessary to go to bed on washing day, and to wait until the laundering was finished, and such repairs made as constant wear had caused and further wear demanded. How to replenish it and to meet other simple urgent needs gave me cause for some concern, and I was going over the problem as I lay on Puarei's guest bed. It was toward the end of my second week at Rutiaro, and already I was beginning to look decidedly shabby. My shoes were rotted out with sea water, and both shirt and trousers, which were far from new at the time of my arrival, gave evidence of early dissolution. Poura had washed, sewed on buttons, drawn seams together, but the garments were chronically ailing, as hopeless of effective repair as an old man far gone into senile decay. Poura was becoming discouraged about them, and I knew that she must be wondering why I didn't buy some fresh ones. I had a very good reason for not doing so. I had no money. I had been left at Retiaro without so much as a 25-centime piece, and the Banque d'Indochine was 600 miles away. It would not occur to either Paris or his wife that I was in need of funds. Theirs was one of the more primitive atolls in the Low Archipelago, where all white men are regarded as mysteriously affluent. If, instead of being marooned at Retiaro through Tino's fit of temper, I had been discovered a mile outside the reef, making toward the land clad only in a pair of swimming trunks, upon reaching it my rescuers would have expected me, as a matter of course, to take a bulky parcel of 1,000-franc notes from beneath that garment. I had, in fact, made a secret inventory of my wealth after the sudden departure of the Caleb Winship, hoping there might be a forgotten bank-note in one of my trouser pockets. What I found was a cotton handkerchief, a picture postcard of the Woolworth Building, and a small musical instrument called an ocarina, or, more commonly, a sweet potato whistle. The handkerchief I needed. The postcard seemed of no practical use as a means of barter, and while I might have given up the ocarina, it had built a slight monetary value. Moy Ling, the Chinese storekeeper of the village, was not interested in it. I didn't offer it to him outright. Instead, I played on it in front of his shop, the March of the Black Watch, which I could render with some skill. Thereafter every youngster on the island coveted the instrument, but Moy Ling made no offers, and the prospect of a wardrobe was as far away as ever. His supply of European clothing was limited, but ample to supply my wants. He found for me 3 undershirts, size 44, 2 gingham outer shirts of less ample proportions, a pair of dungaree overalls, and a pair of rope-sole shoes. I asked him to put these articles aside and went off to reflect upon ways and means of opening a credit account with the canny Chinaman. There was one possible method open to me. I might adapt the Peru as a costume. I could buy 3 of them for the price of 1 undershirt, and I believed that Moy Ling would trust me to that extent. Nearly all of the natives wore parus. They had put aside their trousers and shirts and gingham dresses, now that I was no longer a stranger to them, and were much more comfortable in their simple knee-length garments, those of the men reaching from the waist, those of the women twisted tightly under the arms. Simple and convenient though it was, I felt that it would be absurd for me to assume that type of dress, since I was not accustomed to it. Furthermore, I remembered the ridiculous appearance of Americans and Europeans I had seen at Tahiti, queer people from all sorts of queer places who come and go through the French capital of Oceania. They rushed into Perus the moment of their arrival. At Papeete, and before a week had passed, were more primitive in a sophisticated way than the Tahitians themselves. I had no desire to join the ranks of the amateur cannibals, even though there was some excuse for it at Retiaro, and I knew that the Paumotuans would have more respect for me if I dressed after the manner of my own race. But how to obtain clothing without money, without divulging to anyone that I had no money? The question dined through my brain with annoying persistence, like the thunder of falling water on Paris's iron roof. Would it, after all, be best to confide in the chief? I could tell him of my bank account at Papeete, and he knew, of course, that the Caleb Winship had left me without a word of warning, taking my sea-chest with her. I was tempted to make a confession of my predicament, but pride, or a kind of childish vanity, prevented me. "No, by Jove," I said, "I'll be hanged if I do. Paris, his wife, all the rest of them expect me to live up to their traditional conceptions of white men. I am supposed to be mysteriously affluent, and I owe it to them to preserve that myth in all its romantic glamour." I had no feeling of guilt in making this decision, rather a sense of virtue, like that of an indulgent father upon assuring his children that there is a Santa Claus. I decided to be not only mysteriously but incredibly affluent. Therefore, when the rain had passed, I put on my mended garments and went to Moy Ling's shop. I found him splitting coconuts in front of his copra shed, and beckoned to him in a careless way. He came forward, smiling pleasantly as usual, but there was a shrewd glitter in his eyes which said quite as plainly as words, "Honorable sir, I bow before you, but I expect an adequate monetary return for the service." I was not intimidated, however, and when he brought forth the articles I had selected earlier, I waved them aside, all of them, excepting the rope-soled shoes, the only male footgear of any kind on the island. I explained that I had not before seen the bolt of white dill, the most expensive cloth in his shop, and that I wanted enough of it to make 4 suits. I saw at once that I had risen in his estimation about 75%, and thus encouraged, I went on buying lavishly: white cotton cloth for underwear and shirts, some pencils, and his entire supply of notebooks for my voluminous observations on the life and character of the Paumotuans, a Night King flash lamp, a dozen silk handkerchiefs of Chinese manufacture, a dozen pairs of earrings and 4 lockets and chains, 10 kilos of flour and 2 of coffee, 3 bottles of perfume in fancy boxes, 4 large bolts of ribbon, enough to reach from one end of the village to the other, side and back combs for women, superbly ornamented with bits of colored glass, a bolt of mosquito netting, a monkey wrench, 2 beacon lanterns, a pendulous mat, and 1 bow tie already made up, the kind sold at home in gents' furnishing shops. At the beginning I had no thought of going in so recklessly, but as I went from article to article, the conviction grew upon me that the deeper I plunged, the greater the impression I should make upon Moy Ling, and it was essential that I should convince him that my mythical wealth was real. He became more and more deferential as my heap of purchases increased in size. I made no inquiry as to the price of anything, believing that to be in keeping with the mysteriously affluent tradition. At my back I heard a hum of excited conversation. The shop was filled with people. I felt the crush behind me, but took no notice of it, and went on with my passionless orgy of spending. 2 bolts of linen dress goods, 4 pocket knives, a can of green paint, and another of white. But details are tiresome. It is enough to say that I bought lavishly and selected odds and ends of things because Moy's shop contained nothing else. He had a large supply of food, but in other respects his stock was low, and when I had finished, some of his shelves were almost bare. On one there remained only a box of chewing gum. An inscription printed on the side of it read, "Chew on, Macduff. You can't chew out the original mint leaf flavor," or somebody's pepsin gum words to that effect. That product of American Epicureanism is to be found, strangely enough, at nearly every Chinaman's store in the Low Archipelago. I bought 20 packages of it, since there were no other confections to be had, and distributed them among the children. The youthful Macduffs chewed on for some 30 seconds and then swallowed, believing in their unenlightened way that gum is a sort of food. I had read of monkeys dying in zoos because of the same practice, but in so far as I knew, there were no ill effects from it at Retiaro, either then or later. I succeeded very well in impressing Puarei. He was astonished at the number of my purchases, and Poura said "Aye!" shooed out the mint-breath porters who carried them into the house, and sat down in the doorway, her enormous body completely blocking the entrance. On the veranda the conversation crackled and sparkled with conjecture. I could hear above others the voice of Paki, the wife of the constable, enumerating the things I had bought. It sounded odd in Paumotuan, a high-pitched recitative of strange words, most of them adapted from the English, since all the articles were unknown to the natives before the coming of the traders. Faura, flower; rapine, ribbon; penny, pencil or pen; toaf, coffee, etc. I myself was wondering what use I could make of some of my wealth. The flour I could give to Puarei, and his 10-ton cutter was badly in need of paint. Poura would be glad to have the dress goods for herself and her girls, for the Rotarians put aside their poros on Sunday and are dressed in European costume. I could also give her the mosquito netting as a drapery for the guest bed. I had, in fact, bought it with that end in mind, for on windless nights, particularly after a rain, the mosquitoes were a fearful nuisance. Puarei's household was used to them, but I tossed and tumbled, and at last would have to paddle out on the lagoon and stay there till morning. The coffee, likewise, was for my own use, Puarei believing that the drinking of either tea or coffee was forbidden by his variety of the Christian religion. Tobacco, too, was a product of evil, and the use of it made broad the way to hell. It is impossible to believe that any missionary would wander so far to preach such theology. What had happened, very likely, was that one of the more austere churchmen who visit Rutiaro at rare intervals had condemned those white man's comforts as injurious to health. He must have been severe in his denunciation, for Puarei had got the idea that abstinence from the enjoyment of them was exacted in a sort of amendment to the 10 Commandments. I did my best to corrupt him, for breakfast at his house was to me a cheerless meal. His faith was not to be shaken, however, although he admitted that coffee drinking might not damn me, since I had been taught to believe that it would not. I was thinking with pleasure of his tolerance and of the comforting beverage I should have the following morning, when I remembered that mine was green Tahiti coffee, which must be taken to Moy Ling for roasting. His shop was deserted. I could see it at the end of the sunlit street, steaming with moisture after the rain. The open doorway was a square of black shadow, lightened with a misty glimmer as I watched, and suddenly Moy flashed into view. He ran quickly down the steps, halted irresolutely, and stood for a moment shading his eyes with his hand, looking in the direction of Puarei's house. Then he turned, mounted the steps again, and vanished slowly in the gloom. I was uneasy, knowing what he was thinking. But an island less than 3 miles long, with an average width of 400 yards, offers a poor refuge for a faint-hearted debtor. And so, having stowed my other purchases under the guest bed, I took the bag of coffee and returned to Moy's store, hoping that I might quiet his fears by increasing my obligation to him. When one is without them, clothing, coffee, tobacco, and other such necessities assume a place of exaggerated importance, which is the reason why the memories of the earlier part of my stay at Rutiaro are tinged with the thought of them. But I had not come to the Low Islands to spend all of my time and energy in the mere fight for a comfortable existence. I could have done that quite as well at home, with greater results in the development of a more or less Crusoe-like resourcefulness. At Rutiaro the life was strange and new to me, and I found the days too short for observing it and the nights for reflecting upon it. My first interest, of course, was Puarei's household. The chief, his wife, 2 sons, and 3 daughters, all housed in that one-room frame building. The room was commodious, however, about 20 feet by 15, and on the lagoon side there was a broad veranda where Poura and her daughter did much of their work and passed their hours of leisure. Behind the house was a large cistern, built of blocks of cemented coral, and a small out-kitchen made of the odds and ends of packing cases and roofed with thatch. I wondered at Puarei's preference for a board box covered with corrugated iron to the seemly houses of the other Rutiarians. He thought it a palace, and being a chief, the richest man of the atoll, it was in keeping with the later Paumotuan tradition that he should have a white man's kind of dwelling. Unsightly though it was, without the economy of furnishing, gave the interior an air of pleasant spaciousness, like that of the island itself, with its scarcity of plant life and of trees other than the coconut. There was no European furniture, with the exception of a sewing machine and the guest bed, an old-fashioned slatted affair which looked strange in that environment. On it was a mattress of Cosbach and 2 immense pillows filled with the same material. The linen was immaculate, and the outer coverlet decorated with hibiscus flowers worked in silk. I had no hesitation in accepting the bed, for it would not have held Puarei and his wife. The slats would have given away at once under their weight, and Poura assured me that the children preferred sleeping on their mats on the veranda. The rest of the furnishings were like those of the other houses: 2 or 3 chests for clothing, pandanus mats for the floor, paddles, fishing spears, and water glasses, stacked in a corner or lying across the rafters. An open cabinet of native manufacture held the toilet articles of the women, a hand mirror, a few combs, and a bottle of unscented coconut oil, the one cosmetic of the Low Islands, which was used by all members of the family. There were also several articles of jewelry, such as the trader's cell, some fishing hooks of pearl shell, and, on a lower shelf, a Tahitian Bible. The walls were hung with branches of curiously formed coral, hat wreaths, and necklaces of shell wrought in beautiful and intricate designs. There were no pictures other than the open windows looking out on the lagoon in one direction and in the other across the level, shaded floor of the island towards the sea. We spent but little time indoors. All of the cooking was done in the open, and we had our food there, sitting cross-legged around a cloth of green fronds. The trees around us furnished the dishes. I had not used my tin spoon and the two-pronged fork since the evening of my arrival, and learned to suck the Mai Tai sauce from my fingers with as loud a zest as any of them. Usually we had 2 meals a day at Rutiaro, but there was no regularity about the time of serving them. We ate when we were hungry, and food was to be had sometimes in the middle of the afternoon and as late as 10 in the evening. That is one reason why I remember so well the feast prepared by Poura and her daughters and served by them, for they never sat down to their own food until we had finished. Feasts of a simple kind, but by Jove, how good everything tasted after a day of fishing and swimming in the lagoon or out at sea. I didn't tire of coconuts as quickly as I had feared I should, and the fish were prepared in a variety of ways, boiled, roasted over hot stones, grilled on the coals, or we ate them raw with a savor of Mai Tai sauce. Puarei's dog, one of the best fishers of the island, was the only member of the family discriminating in his requirements. He often came up while we were at dinner with a live fish in his mouth, which he would lay at Poura's feet, looking at her appealingly until she cooked it for him. Sometimes, to tease him, she threw it away, but he would bring it back and, no matter how hungry he might be, refused to eat it raw. The sea furnished occasional variety of diet in the way of turtles and devilfish, and I contributed rice, tinned meat, and other preserved food which I bought of Moy Ling whenever I imagined his confidence in me was beginning to falter. That was a risky procedure, only to be undertaken on the days when I was so filled with animal spirits that I more than half believed in my wealth, in my power to draw money or anything else I wanted out of the clear, dry air of Rutiaro. One thing I had wanted from the first, above all others, a house. The idea of imposing indefinitely upon Puarei's hospitality was distasteful, and no boats were expected within 5 or 6 months. I had not, in years, lived for so long a period at any one place. Here was an opportunity I had often dreamed of for having a home of my own. I should have to ask the chief for it, and at first thought the request seemed a large one. Then, too, how could I say to him with any show of logic, "Puarei, I am not willing to bother you longer by occupying the guest bed in your house. Therefore, will you please give me a house to myself?" He might think I had peculiar ideas of delicacy, but further reflection convinced me that while I could not ask him for a pair of trousers, not even for so trifling a thing as a shirt-button, since he would have to purchase it at Moy Ling's store, I might legitimately suggest the gift of a house. It would cost only the labor of making it, and that was not great. At Rutiaro, houses were built in less time than was needed to sail across the lagoon and back. The inhabitants might reasonably have adopted the early Chinese method of roasting pig by putting the carcasses in their dwellings and setting fire to the thatch. It would have been a sensible procedure, employed at times when the old thatch needed renewal. Nothing permanent would have been destroyed except the framework of poles, and that could be replaced as easily as firewood could be cut for a Maori oven. The upshot of the matter was that I was given not only a house, but an island of my own to set it on. I, who had lived much of my life up 4 or 5 flights of stairs, in furnished rooms, looking out on chimney pots and brick courts filled with odors and family washings. The site was a small motu lying at the entrance to the lagoon, 4 miles from the village island. It had a name which meant the place where the souls were eaten. Once a man, his wife, and 2 children went there to fish on the reef near the pass. All of them were taken ill of some mysterious disease and died on the same day. As their souls left their bodies, they were seized and eaten by some vindictive human spirits in the form of sea-birds. The legend was evidently a very ancient one, and the events which it described had happened so long ago that fear of the place had largely vanished. Nevertheless, the chief tried to persuade me to choose another site, and Poura, when she learned that I wanted to live on the Soul Eaters' Island, was deeply concerned. Neither of them could understand why I should want to live away from the village island. I wince even now when I think of the appalling tactlessness of that request. But the fact is that the Paumotuans themselves, by their example, had got me into the vicious habit of truth-telling in such matters. There is no word in their language for tact. They believe that a man has adequate, although sometimes hidden, reasons for doing what he wants to do, and they understand that it explains seemingly uncourtly behavior. I had accepted, almost unconsciously, their own point of view, so that it didn't occur to me to invent any polite falsehoods. But my knowledge of Paumotuan was more limited than Pouri's knowledge of French, and how was I to explain my desire for so lonely a place as the Soul Eaters' Island? The Paumotuans, from their scarcity of numbers, the isolation of their fragments of land, the dangers of the sea around them, are drawn together naturally, inevitably. How make clear to them the unnatural gregariousness of life in great cities? Suddenly I thought of my picture postcard of the Woolworth Building. I told them that in America many people, thousands of them, were cooped together in houses of that sort. I had been compelled to spend several years in one, and had got such a horror of the life that I had come all the way to the Cloud of Islands, searching for a place where I might be occasionally alone. While the postcard was passing from hand to hand, Huari, the constable, loyal friend in every emergency, gave color to my explanation by describing for the 1,001st time, I suppose, his adventures in San Francisco. Dusk deepened. The last ghostly light faded from the clouds along the northern horizon, and still he talked on, and the idlers on the chief's veranda listened with as keen interest as though they had never heard the story before. Poura, who was at work on my new wardrobe, lit a lamp and placed it on the floor beside her, shading it from her eyes with a piece of matting. The light ran smoothly over her brown hands, and the mountain of shadow behind her blotted out the forms of the trees. Now and then she put down her work and gazed intently in Huari's direction. His voice rose and fell, thrilled with excitement, died away to a deep whisper of awe as he told of the wonders he had seen, the streetcars, the lofty buildings, elevators which rose to an immense height as swiftly as a coconut would fall, the trains, the motors, the ships, the pictures which were alive. He imitated sounds with amazing fidelity, and his gestures, vaguely seen in the gloom, were vividly pictorial of the marvels he had met with in his travels. The story ended abruptly, and Huari sat down, conscious of the effect he had produced. No one spoke for a long while. Then the chief, who was sitting beside me, broke the silence with that strange Polynesian exclamation of wonder too great for words. "Ah, ah, 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 ah," uttered with distinct, rapid precision, like the staccato of machine-gun fire. He laid his hand on my knee affectionately, with an air of possessorship, and at the contact a feeling of pride rose in me, as though I were the planner of the cities, the magician whose brain had given birth to the marvels Huari had described. But conceit of that kind may be measurably reduced by a moment of reflection. And I remembered that the extent of my contribution to my native land was that I had left it. Small cause for vanity there. However, I had no mind for another tussle with my conscience. I had been the indirect cause of eloquence in Harari and of the enjoyment in all his auditors. That was enough for one evening, on the credit side. On the other side, to Puarei, to Poura, to his children, and to all the kindly, hospitable people of Rutiaro, I was under an obligation I could never hope to cancel. But they didn't expect me to cancel it. I was not even under the necessity of showing appreciation. Just as there is no word in their language for tact, there is none approaching our word, gratitude, in meaning. To a man in my position, owner of Soul Eaters Island, and of a house to be built there the following day, that was something to be grateful for. The Chinese language is richer, I believe, in terms implying obligation. I was reminded less pleasantly of another account on the debit side, by the flare of a match which lit up, for a moment, the pensive, cadaverous face of Moy Ling. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Faery Lands of the South Seas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Chapter 8. An Adventure in Solitude. I awoke some time during the latter part of the night with the bemused presentiment that a longed-for event was approaching or in the process of happening. Hands had passed lightly over my face, either that or I had dreamed it, and I heard a faint shout coming from the borderland between sleeping and waking. Puarei's guest bed, with its billowy mattress of kapok, seemed strangely hard, which led to the discovery that I was not lying on a bed, but on a mat in the corner of an empty room. The floor was covered with crushed coral shell, which made a faint radiance in the gloom, and a roof of green thatch was alight with reflections of moving water. I was trying to puzzle out whose house this could be, when I heard the shout again, clearly this time, in a pause of silence between deafening claps of thunder. From nearer at hand came the sound of subdued laughter. Something elfish, light-hearted, in the quality of it, stirred a dim memory, and there flashed into mind the lines of an old poem. "Come, dear children, come out and play. The moon is shining as bright as day. Up the ladder and over the wall." Raising my head quickly, I saw through the open doorway their perfect illustration. The wall was the smooth wall of the sea, with a waning moon rising just clear of it, sending a path of light to the strip of white beach in front of the house. The palm trees bordering the shore swarmed with children who were throwing down nuts. One ancient tree, its stem a fantastic curve, held its foliage far out over the water at a point where the floor of the narrow outer lagoon shelved steeply toward the reef, some 50 yards distant. Both boys and girls were shinning up the trunk one after the other, diving from the plume top, dropping feet foremost, jumping with their hands clasped around their knees into the foaming water. The wreckage of huge combers, which broke on the reef, pouring across it into the inner shallows. A second group had gathered in the moonlit area just before the doorway. Several youngsters were peering intently in my direction. Others were playing a sort of hand-clapping game to the accompaniment of an odd little sing-song. A small girl with a baby riding astride her hip walked past, and I saw another of 10 or 12 standing at the edge of the track of shimmering light, holding a coconut to her lips with both hands. Her head was bent far back, and her hair hung free from her shoulders as she drained the cool liquid to the last drop. Imagine coming out of the depths of sleep to the consciousness of such a scene. I was hardly more sure of the reality of it than I had been of the shout, the touch of hands. It was like a picture out of a book of fairy tales, but one quick with life, the figures coming and going against a background of empty sea, where the long swell broke in lines of white fire on a ledge of coral. I remembered where I was, of course, in my own house, which stood on the ocean side of a small motu known in the Paumotuan legend as the island where the souls were eaten. The house had been built for me only the day before by the order of Puarei, chief of the atoll of Rutiaro, and the motu was one of a dozen uninhabited islands which lay on the 30-mile circumference to the lagoons. It was ordered by chance which took me there. Perhaps that I was never to see the place in the clear light of usual experience, but rather through a glimmer like that of remembered dreams, a long succession of dreams in which, night after night, events shape themselves according to the heart's desire, or even more fantastically, with an airy disregard of any semblance to reality. So it was, waking from sleep on the first night which I slept under my own roof. I was almost ready to believe that my presence there was not the result of chance. Waywardness of fancy is one of the most godlike of the attributes of that divinity, but the display of it is as likely as not to be unfriendly. Here there seemed to be reasoned, kindly action. Providence, I said to myself. Providence, without a doubt. A little repentant, perhaps, because of questionable gifts in the past. A whimsical Providence, to which delighted in shocking my sense of probability. What could those children be doing on Soul Eaters Island in the middle of the night? I myself had left the village island 4 miles distant, only a few hours earlier, and at that time everyone was asleep. There was not a sound of human activity in the settlement, not a glimmer of light to be seen anywhere excepting in Moy Ling's, the Chinaman's shop, and on the surface of the lagoon where lay the misty reflections of the stars. Perhaps, I thought, these are not earthly children. Maybe they are the ghosts of those whose souls were eaten here so many years ago. I was more than half serious in thinking of that possibility. Stranger things had happened on islands not so far removed from the world of men. I dressed very quietly and went to the door, taking care to keep well in the shadow, so that I might look on for a moment without being seen. My doubts vanished at once. Not only the children had come out to play, fathers and mothers as well. Tamatanga was there, and Rikata, and Niha, and Pohu, and Tahari, and Hunga, Naitane, Naivane, Tamaha, Monamo, Hawaki, and I saw old Ragunete, who was at least 70 and a grandmother several times over, clapping her hands with others of her generation and swaying from side to side in time to the music of Copia's accordion. All the older people were grouped around Pari, who was seated in an old deck-chair, a sort of throne, which was carried about for him wherever he went. Pora, his wife, lay on a mat beside him, her chin propped on her hands. Both greeted me cordially, but offered no explanation for the reason of the midnight visit. I was glad that they didn't. I liked the casualness of it, which was quite in keeping with habits of life at Retiaro. But I couldn't help smiling, remembering my reflections earlier in the evening. I believed then that I was crossing the threshold of what was to be an adventure in solitude, and was in a mood of absurdly useful elation at the prospect. I was to delve deeply, for the first time, into my own resources against loneliness. I had known the solitude of cities, but there one has the comfortable sense of nearness to others, the refuge of books, pictures, music, all the distractions which prevent any very searching examination of one's capacity for a life of retirement. At Soul Eaters Island I would have no books, no pictures, excepting a colored postcard of the Woolworth Building, which had won me this opportunity. And for music, I was limited to what I could make for myself with my ocarina, my sweet potato whistle, which had a range of 1 octave. Thus scantily provided with diversions, I was to learn how far my own thoughts would serve to make a solitary life not only endurable, but pleasant. So I had dreamed as I paddled down the lagoon, with my island taking form against the starlit sky to the eastward. It was one of those places which set one to dreaming, which seem fashioned by nature for the enjoyment of a definite kind of experience. Seeing it, whether by day or by night, The most gregarious of men, I'm sure, would have become suddenly enamored of his own companionship, and the most prosaic would have discovered a second meditative self which pleads for indulgence with gentle obstinacy. But alas! my own unsocial nature gained but a barren victory, being robbed at the outset of the fruits of it by the 75 congenial inhabitants of Rutiaro. Here within 6 hours was half the village at my door, and Puarei told me that the rest of it, or as many as were provided with canoes, was following. Evidently he had suggested the invasion. My new house needed warming, or the Paumotuan equivalent to that festival, so they had come to warm it. Preparations were being made on an elaborate scale. The children were gathering green nuts for drinking and fronds for the cloth at the feast. Women and girls were grating the meat of ripe nuts, pressing out the milk of the mutihari, cleaning fish, preparing shells for dishes. Some of the men and the older boys were building native ovens, 8 of them, each one large enough for roasting a pig. All of this work was being carried out under Puarei's direction and to the accompaniment of Kapua's accordion. I wish that I might have, in some way, make real to others the unreal loveliness of the scene. It must be remembered that it took place on one of the loneliest of a lonely cloud of islands, which lay in the midmost solitude of an empty ocean. The moonlight must be remembered, too, and how it lay in splinters of silver on the motionless fronds of the palms, as though it were of the very texture of their polished surfaces. And you must hear Kapua's accordion and the shouts of the children as they dove into the pool of silvered foam. The older ones, out of respect to me, I think, wore wisps of paru cloth about their loins, but the babies were as naked as on the day they were born. Tereki was standing among these 5- and 6-year-olders who were too small for the climb to the diving place, taking them up sometimes 2 at once and tossing them into the pool among the others, where they were as much at home as so many minnows. Watching them, I thought with regret of my own lost opportunities as a child. I felt a deep pity for all the children of civilization who must wear clothing and who never know the joy of playing at midnight and by moonlight too. Mothers' clubs and child welfare organizations would do well to consider the advisability of repealing the old "to bed at 7" law and bugbear of all children. Its only merits, if it may be so called, is that it fosters in children a certain melancholy intellectual enjoyment in such poems as "Up the Ladder and Over the Wall," where the forbidden pleasures are held out to them as though they were natural ones, which most of them are, of course, and quite possible of attainment. I was sorry that Tino, supercargo of the Calabash Winship, could not be present to see how blithely the work went forward. He had called the people of Rutiaro a lazy lot, and he was right. They were lazy according to the standards of temperate climates, but when they worked toward an end which pleased them, their industry was astonishing. Tino's belief was that man was made to labor, whether joyfully or not, in order that he might increase his wealth, whether he needed or not, and that of the world at large. I remember meeting somewhat the same point of view in reading the lives and memoirs of some of the old missionaries to the islands. It seemed to have irked them terribly, finding a people who had never heard that doleful hymn, "Work, for the night is coming." They, too, believed that the needs of the Polynesians should be increased, but for ethical reasons, in order that they should be compelled to cultivate regular habits of industry in order to satisfy them. Although I don't agree with it, Tino's seemed to me the sounder conviction. The missionaries might have argued as reasonably for a general distribution of Job-like boils, in order that the virtues of patience and fortitude might have wider dissemination, but neither trade nor religion had altered to any noticeable extent the habits of life at Rotario. The people worked as they had always done, under the press of necessity. Their simple needs being satisfied, their inertia was a thing to marvel at. I have often seen them sitting for hours at a time, moving only with the shadows which sheltered them. There was something awe-inspiring in their immobility, in their attitude of profound reverie. I felt at times that I was living in a land under perpetual enchantment of silence and sleep. These periods of calm, or as Tino would say, laziness, were usually brought to an end by Puarei. It was a fascinating thing to watch him throwing off the enchantment. So gradual the process was, and so strange the contrast when he was thoroughly awakened and had roused the village from its long sleep. Then would follow a period of activity. Fishing, copra-making, canoe-building, whatever there was to do would be done, not speedily perhaps, but smoothly, and fasts would be broken, in the case of many of the villagers, for the first time in 2 or 3 days. My house was built during such a period. I was still living with Puarei in the village island, wondering when, if ever, I was to have the promised dwelling. Then one afternoon, while I was absent on a shell-gathering expedition, the village set out en masse for Soul Eaters Island, cut the timbers, branded the fronds, erected, swept, and garnished my house, and were at the settlement again before I myself had returned. That task finished, here they were back for the warming festival, and the energy spent in preparing for it would have more than loaded Tino's schooner with copra. I couldn't flatter myself that all of this was done solely to give me pleasure. They found pleasure in it, too. Furthermore, I knew that an unusually long interval of fasting called for compensation in the way of feasting. Puarei was in a gay mood. Religion sat rather heavily upon him sometimes by virtue of his Papeete schooling. He was the chief elder of his church, but once he sloughed off his air of latter-day saintliness, he made a splendid master of revels, and he threw it aside the moment the drums began to beat, and led a dozen of the younger men in a dance which I had not seen before. It was very much like modern Swedish drill set to music, except that the movements were as intricate and graceful as they were exhausting. 3 kinds of drums were used. One, an empty gasoline tin, upon which the drummer kept up a steady roll while the dance was in progress. The rhythm for the movements was indicated by 3 others, 2 of them beating hollowed cylinders of wood, while a third was provided with an old French army drum of the Napoleonic period. The syncopation was extraordinary. Measures were divided in an amazing variety of ways, and often, when the opportunity seemed lost, the fragments joined perfectly, just as the next one was at hand. The music was a kaleidoscope in sound, made up of unique and startling variations in tempo, as the dance moved from one figure to the next. At the close of it, Kaupia took up her accordion again, and dancing by some of the women followed. At length, Rangituki, grandmother though she was, could resist the music no longer. The others gave way to her, and in a moment she was dancing alone, proudly, with a sort of wistful abandon, as though she were remembering her youth, throwing a last defiance in the teeth of time. Kaupia sang as she played to an air which had but 4 changes in it. The verse was 5 words long and repeated endlessly. Ta fra to patamai, ta fra po tatamai. Both the words and the air had a familiar sound. They called to mind a shadowy picture of 3 tall, thin women in spangled skirts, all of them beating tambourines in unison and dancing in front of a painted screen. I couldn't account for this strange vision at first. It glimmered faintly, far in the depths of subconscious memory, like a colored newspaper supplement lying in murky water at the end of a pier. Suddenly it rose into focus, drawn to the surface by the buoyant splendor of a name. I remembered then a vaudeville troupe, which long ago made sorry capital of its lack of comeliness, and I saw them again on the island, where the souls were eaten as clearly as ever I had as a youngster, knocking their tambourines or bony elbows, shaking their curls, and saying, "Shoo fly, don't bother me," in shrill, cracked voices. Kaupia's version was merely a phonetic translation of the words. They meant nothing in the Paumotuan dialect. and, old woman though she was, Rangituki's dance, which accompanied the music, played in faster and faster time, was in striking contrast to the angular movements of the Cherry Sisters, tripping it in the background across the dim footlights of the 1890s. Other canoes were arriving during this time, and at last a large canoe, which had put off from the ocean side of the village island, was seen making in toward the pass. It was loaded with pigs and chickens, the most important part of the feast, and had been eagerly awaited for more than an hour. Shouts of anticipation went up from the shore as the boat drew in with its wished-for freight. But these were a little premature. There was a stretch of ugly, broken water to be passed, where the swift ebb from the lagoon met the swell of the open sea. The canoe was badly jostled in crossing it, and some of the chickens, having worked loose from their bonds, escaped. Like the dogs of the atolls, the chickens were of a wild breed, and they took through the air with sturdy wings. The chase from the shore began at once, but it was a hopeless one. Soul Eaters Island is 500 yards long by 300 broad, and there is another on the opposite side of the pass, which is more than a mile in extent. We made frantic efforts to prevent them from reaching it. We threw sticks and stones, tried to entice them with broken coconuts, the meat temptingly accessible. It was to no purpose. They had been enticed before. Their crops were full, and several hours of captivity had made them wary. Furthermore, like all Polynesian chickens, they seemed to have a racial memory of what they had been in other times, in less congenial environments, of the lean days when they had been caught and eaten at will, chased by dogs, run down by horses. They were not so far from all as to have lost conscious pride in the regained prerogative of flight. The last we saw of them, they were using it to splendid advantage over the rapid stream which separated the two islands. One old hen alone remained perched on the top of a coconut tree on Soul Eaters Island. She was in no hurry to leave. She knew that she could follow the others whenever she liked, and she knew that we knew it. She seemed drunk with a sense of freedom and power, and cackled proudly, as though more than half convinced that the nuts clustered in the nest of foliage beneath her wings were eggs which she had laid. Knowing the wholesomeness of the Paumotan appetite, I could understand why the loss of the chickens was regarded seriously. A dozen of them remained, and we had 8 pigs weighing from 100 to 150 pounds each, to say nothing of some 50 pounds of fish. All of this was good in so far as it went, but there was a gloomy shaking of heads as we returned from our fruitless chase. Not that the Paumotians were particularly fond of chicken. On the contrary, they didn't care generally for a fowl of any sort, but it serves to fill odd corners of their capricious stomachs. It was this they were thinking of, and the possible lack, at the end of the feast, of the feeling of almost painful satiety, which is to them an essential after-dinner sensation. In this emergency I contributed 4 one-pound tins of beef and salmon, my entire stock of substantial provisions for the adventure in solitude. But I could see that Puarei, as well as the others, regarded this as a mere relish, a wholly acceptable but light course of hors d'oeuvres. Fortunately, there was at hand an inexhaustible reservoir of food, the sea, and we prepared to go there for further supplies. I never lost an opportunity to witness those fish-spearing expeditions. Once I had tried my hand as a participant, and found myself as dangerously out of my element as a Paumotan would be at the joystick of an airplane. I saw a great many fish, but I could not have speared one of them if it had been moored to the bottom, and after a few absurd attempts was myself fished into the boat half drowned. I lay there a few minutes gasping for breath, my eardrums throbbing painfully from the attempt to reach unaccustomed depths. The experiment convinced me that fish-spearing in the open sea is not an easily acquired art, but one handed down in its perfection through the last 20 generations of Low Island ancestors. It is falling into disuse in some of the atolls, where wealth is accumulating and tinned food plentiful, but the inhabitants of Rutiaro still follow it with old-time zest. they handled their spears affectionately, as anglers handle and sort their flies. These are true sportsmen's weapons, provided with a single unbarbed dart, bound with sinnet to a tapering shaft from 8 to 10 feet long. Their water goggles, like their spears, they make for themselves. They are somewhat like an aviator's goggles, discs of clear glass fitted in brass rims, with an inner cushion of rubber which cups closely around the eyes, preventing the entrance of water. When adjusted, they give the wearer an owlish appearance, like the horn-rimmed spectacles which used to be affected by American undergraduates. Thus equipped, with their parus girded into loincloths, a half-dozen of the younger men jumped into the rapid current which flows past Soul Eaters Island and swam out to sea. Tohekia, Tehina, Pinga, the boat-steerer, and I followed in a canoe. Dawn was at hand, and, looking back, I saw the island, my house, and the crowd on the beach in the suffused, unreal light of sun and fading moon. In front of us the swimmers were already approaching the tumbled waters at the entrance to the pass. Upon reaching it, they disappeared together, and I next saw them far on the other side, swimming in a direction parallel to the reef and some 50 yards beyond the breaking point of the surf. When we joined them, the sun was above the horizon, and they were already at the sport. They lay face down on the surface of the water, turning their heads now and then for a breath of air. They swam with an easy breaststroke and a barely perceptible movement of the legs, holding their spears with their toes near the end of the long shaft. Riding the long, smooth swell, it was hard to keep them in view, and they were diving repeatedly, coming to the surface again at unexpected places. Through the clear water I could see every crevice and cranny in the shelving slope of coral, the mouths of gloomy caverns which undermined the reef, in swarms of fish as strangely colored as the coral itself, passing through them, flashing across sunlit spaces, or hovering in the shadows of overhanging ledges. It was a strange world to look down upon, and stranger still to see men moving about it as though it were their natural home. Sometimes they grasped their spears as a poniard would be held for a downward blow, sometimes with the thumb forward, thrusting with an underhand movement. They were marvelously quick and accurate at striking. I had a nicer appreciation of their skill after my one attempt, which had proven to me how difficult it is to judge precisely the distance, the location of the prey, and the second for the thrust. A novice was helpless. He suffered under the heavy pressure of the water, and the long holding of his breath cost him agonizing effort. Even though he were comfortable physically, he might chase, with as good a result, the dancing reflections of a mirror, turned this way and that in the sunlight. As they searched the depths to the seaward side, the bodies of the fishers grew shadowy, vanished altogether, reappeared as they passed over a lighter background of blue or green, which marked an invisible shoal. At last they would come clearly into view, the spear held erect, rising like embodied spirits through an element of matchless purity, which seemed neither air nor water. The whistling noises which they made as they regained the surface gave the last touch of unreality to the scene. I have never understood the reason for this practice, which is universal among the divers and fishers of the low islands, unless it is that their lungs being famished for air, they breathe it out grudgingly through half-closed teeth. Heard against the thunder of the surf, the sounds, hoarse and shrill according to the wont of the diver, seemed anything but human. We returned in an hour's time, with the canoe half filled with fish, square-nosed tinga-tingas, silvery tanus, brown-spotted kitos, guineras. We had more than made good the loss of the chickens. The preparation for the feast had been completed. The table was set, or better, the cloth of green fronds was laid on the ground near the beach. At each place there was a tin of my colored beef or salmon, the half of a coconut shell filled with raw fish, cut into small pieces in a sauce of matihari, salted coconut milk, and a green coconut for drinking. Along the center of the table were great piles of fish, baked and raw, roast pork and chicken, mounds of bread stacked up like cannon balls. The bread was not of Moy Ling's baking, but made in native fashion, lumps of broiled dough of the size and weight of large grapefruit. One would think that the most optimistic stomach would ache at the prospect of receiving it, but the Paumotuan stomach is of ostrich-like hardihood, and, as I have said, after long fasting it demands quantity rather than quality in food. It was then about 6:30, a seasonable hour for the feast, for the air was still cool and fresh. The food was steaming on the table, but we were not yet ready to sit down to it. Fete days, like Sundays, required costumes appropriate to the occasion, and every one retired into the bush to change clothing. I thought then that I was to be the only disreputable banqueter of the lot, and regretted that I had been so eager to see my new house. Not expecting visitors, I had come away from the village with only my supply of food. Fortunately, Puarei had been thoughtful for me. I found not only my white clothing, but my other possessions, bolts of ribbon, perfume, the cheap jewelry, etc., which I had bought on credit of Moy Ling, and the house itself had been furnished and decorated during the hour when I was out with the fish spears. There was a table and a chair, made of bits of old packing cases, in one corner, and on the sleeping mat a crazy quilt, and a pillow with my name worked in red silk within a border of flowers. Hanging from the ceiling was a faded papier-mâché bell, the kind one sees in grocers' windows at home at Christmas time. This was originally the gift of some trader, and the pictures, too, which decorated the walls. They had been cut from the advertising pages of some American magazine. One of them represented a man dressed in a much-advertised brand of underwear, who was smiling with cool solicitude at two others who were perspiring heavily and wishing, if the legend printed beneath was true, that their underwear bore the same stamp as that of their fortunate comrade. There was another, in color, of a woman smiling across the table at her husband, who smiled back while they ate a particular brand of beans. The four walls of my house were hung with pictures of this sort, strung on cords of coconut fiber. Huirai's work, I was sure, done out of the kindness of his heart. He was merely an unconscious agent of the gods, administering this further reproof for my temerity in seeking consciously an adventure in solitude. As I changed my clothing, I pondered the problem as to how I could get rid of the gallery without giving Huirai offense, and from this I fell to thinking of the people smiling down at me. Is our race made up in large part of such an out-and-out materialists, whose chief joy in life lies in discovering some hitherto untried brand of soup or talcum powder? Do they live, these people? They look real enough in the picture. I seemed to know many of them, and I remembered their innumerable prototypes. I had met in the world I had left only a year before. Well, if they are real, I thought, what has become of the old doomsday men and women who used to stand at street corners with bundles of tracts in their hands, saying to passers-by, "My friend, is your soul saved?" No answer came from the smiling materialists on all sides of me. They smiled still, as though in mockery of my attempt to elude them in whatsoever unfrequented corner of the world, as though life were merely the endless enjoyment of creature comforts, the endless, effortless use of labor-saving devices. One man in his late 50s, who really ought to have been thinking about his soul, had in his eyes only the light of sensual gratification. He was in pajamas and half-shaven, announcing to me, to the world at large, "At last, a razor." The sight of him offering me his useful little instrument put an end to my meditation. I rubbed ruefully a 3-day growth of beard, thinking of the torture in store for me when I should next go to Pinega for a shave. He was the village barber as well as its most skillful boat steerer. His other customers were used to his razor and his methods, and their faces were inured to pain. For had not their ancestors, through countless generations, had their beards plucked out hair by hair? I, on the other hand, was the creature of my own land, of creature comforts. The anticipation of a shave was agony, and the realization, Pinga, sitting on my chest, holding my head firm with one immense hand while he scraped and rasped with his dull razor. That was to die weakly and to live to die again. I got what amusement I could from the thought of the different set of values at Rutiaro. I had only to ask for a house, and Puarei had given me one, with an island of my own to set it on. He thought no more of the request than if I had asked him for a drinking coconut. But not all the wealth of the Low Island pearl fisheries, had it been mine to offer, could have produced for me a safety razor with a dozen good blades. I heard Puarei shouting, "Hamatama!" and went out to join the others, my unshaved beard in woeful contrast to my immaculate white clothing. But my guest or host had the native courtesy of many primitive people, and I was not made conscious of my unreaped chin. Furthermore, everyone was hungry, and so after Puarei had said grace for the Church of Latter-day Saints, and Huari a second one for the Reformed Church of Latter-day Saints, and Natal a third as the Catholic representative, we fell to without further loss of time. The enjoyment of food is assuredly one of the great blessings of life, although it is not a cause for perpetual smiling, as the writers of advertisements would have one believe. According to the Low Island way of thinking, it is not a subject to be talked about at any length. I like their custom of eating in silence, with everyone giving undivided attention to the business in hand. It gave one the privilege of doing likewise, a relief to a man weary of the unnatural dining habits of more advanced people. It may be a trifle gross to think of your food while you are eating it, but it is natural, and, if the doctors are to be believed, an excellent aid to digestion. Now and then Puarei would say, "Fui mamatera," a thing good that, tapping a haunch of roast pork with his forefinger, and I would reply, "E amatain tau tora," yes, a thing very good that. Then we would fall to eating again. On my right, Hunga went from fish to pork, and from pork to tinned beef, whipping the maitai hauri to his lips with his fingers without the loss of a drop. Only once he paused for a moment and let his eyes wander the length of the table. Shaking his head with a sigh of satisfaction, he said, "Katanga aruha katanga." Food, and yet more food. There is no phrase sweeter to Paumotuan ears than that one. Huari, the constable, was the only one who made any social demands upon me. As already related, he had once made a journey from Papeete to San Francisco as a stoker on one of the mail boats, and was immensely proud of the few English phrases which he had picked up during the voyage. He didn't know the meaning of them, but that made no difference. He could put on side before the others made them believe that he was carrying on an intelligent conversation. "What's the matter?" "Oh, yes, never mind," were among his favorite expressions, unusually mild ones, it seemed to me, for one who had been associated with a gang of Cockney stokers, and he brought them out apropos of nothing. He was an exasperating old hypocrite, but a genial one, and I couldn't help replying to some of his feints at conversation. Once, out of curiosity, wondering what his reply would be, I said, "Huari, you're the worst old four-flusher in the 72 Islands, aren't you?" He smiled and nodded and came back with the most telling of all of his phrases. "You go to hell, me." On that occasion it was delivered with what seemed something more than mere parrot-like aptness of reply. Clipped to his undershirt he wore a fountain pen, which was as much a part of his costume on these dress occasions as his dungaree trousers and pandanus hat. It had a broken point, was always dry, and although Huari read fairly well, he could hardly write his own name. No matter. He would no more have forgotten his pen than a French soldier his cordeliere. But he was not alone in his love for these implements of Papa's white man's culture. There was Havaki, for example, who owned a small folding camera, which he had bought from some trader. The two men were very jealous of each other. Huari had traveled and had a fountain pen, but Havaki's camera was a much more complicated instrument. There had never been any films for it, but he was quite satisfied without them. The camera stood on a shelf at his house, an ever-present proof of his better title to distinction. His chief regret, I believe, was that he couldn't wear it, as Huirai did his pen. But he often carried it with him on Sundays and went through the pretense of taking pictures. Some of the more sanguine still believed that he would one day surprise the village by producing a large number of magnificent photographs. A further account of the feast at Soul Eaters Island would be nothing more than a detailed statement of the amount of food consumed, and it would not be credited as truthful. It is enough to say that it was a latter-day miracle, comparable to the feeding of the 5,000, with this reversal of the circumstances, that food for approximately that number was eaten by 22 men. At last Puarei sat back with a groan of content and said, "Ai, para huri pai tu tatu." It is impossible to translate this literally, but the exact meaning is, "We are all of us full up to the neck." It was true, we were. That is, all of the men. The women and children were waiting, and as soon as we gave them place they set to on the remnants. Fortunately there was, as Hungai has said, food and yet more food, so that no one went hungry. At the close of the feast I saw old Rangituki take a fragment of coconut frond and weave it into a neat basket. Then she gathered into it all of the fish bones and hung the basket from one of the rafters of my house. Rangituki was pure heathen, one of the unredeemed of the Rotarians, but I noticed that some of the Catholics and Latter-day Saints, even Reformed saints of the Latter-day persuasion, all in good standing in their churches, assisted her in making the collection. I had observed the same practice at other islands. At the beginning of a meal thanks were given to the God of Christians for the bounty of the sea, but fishermen's luck was a matter of the first importance, and while the old gods might be overthrown, there seemed to be a fairly general belief that it would not do to trifle with immemorial custom. It was mid-morning before the last of the broken meats had been removed and the beach made tidy. The breeze died away, and the shadows of the palms moved only with the imperceptible advance of the sun. It was a time for rest, for quiet meditation, and all of the older people were gathered in the shade, gazing out over a sea as tranquil as their minds, as lonely as their lives had always been and would always be. I knew that they would remain thus throughout the day, talking a little after the refreshment of light slumbers, but for the most part sitting without speech or movement, their consciousness crossed by vague thoughts which would stir it scarcely more than the cat's paw ruffled the surface of the water. No sudden half-anguished realization of the swift passage of time would disturb the peace of the reverie. No sense of old loss to be retrieved would goad them into swift and feverish action. A land crab moved across a strip of sunlight and sighted into his hole, pulling his grotesque little shadow after him. And the children, restless little spirits, splashed and shouted in the shallows of the lagoon, maneuvering fleets of empty beef and salmon tins, reminders of the strange beginning of my adventure in solitude. End of chapter 8.